and Mrs. Kelly, along with our superintendent, Mr. Testani. If I could ask everyone to please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. And Mrs. Maxon Kennelly, would you start us off, please?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, before we get started, I just wanted to let the board members and the public know that Mr. Asa sends his regards this evening. He had a conflict that he's not able to join us, but wanted to assure everyone that he would watch our meetings afterwards to be abreast of everyone's comments this evening. With that, we will move on to agenda item number 3, feedback from SLAM on the board's scenario criteria from the August 29th, 2023 meeting. There's an enclosure for this that the board has, and it's posted online if everyone hasn't seen it. Mr. Testani, do you want to walk us through this a little bit?
Sure, thank you. After the meeting on the 29th, it was clear that there had been a slight shift in what should be prioritized from the board's perspective as we continue forward in working with the consultants on redistricting options. The racial imbalance number of achieving below 21% became the priority, as well as looking at ECC clustering of classes at 2 elementary schools in addition to 1 high school, one being Holland Hill. So we did sit and we did analyze each of the possibilities that could be the third site in addition to Holland Hill, as well as Holland Hill itself, because there are some slight alterations at Holland Hill to bathrooms to accommodate preschool students, but nothing that can't be overcome. But looking at Burr, as you can see, there are 8 classrooms on the first floor that have bathrooms. However, with ECC and taking into consideration the need to have all kindergarten through 2nd grade classrooms located on the first floor, that would not be possible. Dwight has 8 classrooms with bathrooms. Unfortunately, there is no air conditioning, as we're hearing loud and clear today. And there are some issues in regards to stairs to access the ground level floors. Not included in this, but another issue that we encountered, I guess at a previous time, was the pickup and drop off location is not ideal, as well as some work to the playground would be necessary. But again, as mentioned, that would have to be done at all the schools that currently do not have ECC classrooms, including, if we were going to remain at Stratfield School, a significant upgrade to the playground would be necessary if that was going to be a long-term placement for the program. Jennings does have 11 classrooms with bathrooms. Some of them do have split AC units. A couple do need to be replaced, and there would be some other minor work to get the program started there. According to Mr. Papa George and our walkthrough, the gymnasium is well located, so access from the classrooms with the bathrooms to the gymnasium is pretty accessible. We also have some dedicated OT PT room. There's a CLC there already, and some dedicated office space. So it does make it a little more attractive. Mill Hill has 7 classrooms with bathrooms. However, as we talk through some of this with the SLAM consultants, there is no available space, as everyone is aware of. Therefore, we would have to move out a significant number of kids, which would also add significant transportation needs to the district that we don't believe we can sustain at this point, given our current state of transportation. Riverfield has 3 classrooms with bathrooms, so that obviously is a no-go. We went over to McKinley. McKinley has 4 classrooms currently used by kindergarten with bathrooms. There was mentioned they're open classrooms, nothing significant in alterations to be made if we had to add doors to those classrooms. That would then shift and cause the same issue that we currently have at Burr. We would have to then relocate kindergarten through 2nd grade students, not kindergarten necessarily, but 1st or 2nd graders upstairs, which is not allowed. North Stratfield has the most, 13 classrooms with bathrooms, and they are part of Phase 1 air conditioning, so that would remove the only barrier. Not the greatest pickup and drop-off location, but we could make it work. Sherman is in the same position as Mill Hill. They have 7 classrooms with bathrooms. Because they have no available space, it would again involve moving students out and causing a significant strain on transportation needs. Osborne Hill has 4. Stratfield has 4 with bathrooms currently being used, but again, more playground work than the other sites. So we did give SLAM the direction that was provided by the board from the 29th meeting to use Holland Hill and a second location in addition to Ward. They will provide 2, the Holland Hill and a second location, and 1 for Jennings and a second location to have a side-by-side comparison in time for the September 12th meeting. But they are keeping racial imbalance of a 21% or below at the forefront. But again, we made it clear that they are cognizant of the fact that we do not want to increase our transportation routes beyond what we currently are operating, because that would provide a more difficult strain on our district's transportation needs, and we're not sure that we can meet them.
Okay, thank you. Any comments or questions from the board on this memo? Mr. Peterson.
Hi, thank you for this. This is very helpful. Just very quickly, you mentioned drop-off space potentially for North Stratfield. I remember when the board toured that building in 2018, 2019, whatever that was, we were kind of spitballing whether it would be possible to create a separate entrance off of the Harvester Road exit to the property. I don't know whether that was something that Angelos might have brought up or discussed at all.
He did mention that that was once discussed in the past and that we could revisit that as part of the project, whether it be done for 24-25 or the following year. That would be a possibility that we could explore with the town.
Mrs. Maxon Kennelly.
Just want to clarify that any of these indications of classrooms with bathrooms, that's a standalone classroom, and I ask because this indicates, for example, that Riverfield has 3 classrooms, and yet they also have 2 TLCs at this point, so are those classrooms not with bathrooms?
The classrooms with bathrooms, there are 2 that share a bathroom at Riverfield as well, so there's a Jack and Jill kind of split there. There are 3 bathrooms that could be accessed according to Angeles. We're going to be visiting Riverfield tomorrow morning, so I want to get eyeballs on that one.
Right, so just because I think, again, just so that this is completely accurate as we're comparing, the focus would not be just how many bathrooms, but how many classrooms are serviced by bathrooms.
Correct. According to the rubric that was developed 2 superintendents ago here in Fairfield, I have spoken to other districts who offer preschool, early childhood classes, and not all of them have classrooms with dedicated bathrooms in their facilities. Some of them do have a bathroom, 2 bathrooms in the hallway that are nearby that students would access. So I just want to make that clear as well.
So again, because SLAM can only work well on our behalf if they've got the most accurate information. So before this goes to them, there will have been an on-site visit for every one of these so that it's, okay, you may only have one in the bathroom, but it's right next to a small cluster of rooms, or just that there's analysis of each site so that just these numbers might not tell the full story.
Yeah, we're giving them updates as we visit each one. So we have a couple left, just 2 schools left to visit, to be able to give them if there's any changes to what the floor plans look like.
Okay, and then just the last question. At all of our schools, we do keep K through 2 on the first floor?
Yes.
Thank you.
Mrs. Guernsey.
Thank you so much for this memo, and I'm just wondering, a question through the chair to Mr. Testani. When you do update this document, is this something that you can make available to us and to the public with that updated information?
Sure. Right now, this is all pretty accurate. I think just want to make sure we confirm the Riverfield, Sherman as well, but again, the bathrooms aren't the issue at Sherman. It's more and Mill Hill, it's more moving kids out, creating the transportation needs that we currently may not be able to sustain.
Okay, thank you.
Mrs. Maxine Kelly?
Just a quick follow-up on that. Not that we're looking to do it, because obviously we have certain transportation limitations. However, specifically when you say it would involve students moving out, we know that could happen at any of the 11 schools. This is specifically because it would be at such a level
Correct.
of 5 entire classrooms. So that's
Correct.
just clarifying the language here.
Correct. So the movement out for ECC at Mill Hill and Sherman is at a size of a cluster of kids that we would then impact transportation greatly. Moving small pockets of kids, and I'm not giving a number, from those schools for just redistricting purposes would not have that same cause and effect.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, thank you for putting that memo together. All right, we will move on to agenda item number 4, the community conversation regarding racial balance, academic excellence, facility utilization, and redistricting scenario. So how this will work is that if you would like to engage with the board, you can come up to the podium, just state your name and address, please. And you'll have up to 3 minutes to present any comments, questions you may have, whatnot, and then I'll just open it up to the floor for the board to respond to you, and in a back and forth with you, and then we'll give, there's not too many people here tonight, so give each speaker at least a good solid 10 minutes or so with the board before we move on to the next speaker, just to make sure we get through everyone who would like to work with us this evening. So with that, I will open,
Can I just say one thing before we start? So there was some correspondence that was received over the long weekend regarding if ECCs were placed at 2 schools, Holland Hill and McKinley, if that would solve the racial imbalance, based on an email that someone had received from previous superintendent and current superintendent, Dr. Tony Jones. I don't think the entirety of that email told the full story. I did contact the State Department of Ed today to confirm that we cannot put ECC in those 2 buildings and then just compare the percentages against each other. We are still part of an entire school district, so all the elementary schools would still be calculated as part of the racial imbalance percentage. And I did speak to Dr. Jones as well, and by having ECC in certain buildings, 5 to be exact, it has about, on a good year, about a 0.5% impact on the racial imbalance number. So that is not a possibility to move the needle with any significance. So I just want to take that off the table because I just wanted to make sure everyone knew we did follow up on that request.
thank you very much. Okay, with that, I will open up to the floor. If the first person does no rhyme or reason, just come on up. This is going to be a really quick meeting. No one wants to ask any questions or provide any comments or anything at this time. Great.
Not on a 30-minute bus ride to Tomlinson. And I've actually had that discussion with my third grader already. So I just was wondering if someone could speak to that.
Who would like to speak to that? Mr. Peterson.
You don't have to go away. You could, this could be a back and forth, correct?
Yes.
This is,
Great.
all right, I know in a lot of public comment, we say we don't do back and forth. This is the back and forth time. So there was a scenario that was provided to us by the consultant that said, if this is something that you want to do, we have a plan that could move Stratfield back to sending their kids to Woods, which was the way it was when I was growing up here in town, but was changed many years ago when we went from 2 to 3 middle schools. And when my youngest was in school at Stratfield, she actually got sent to Roger Little Middle School, and there was a rejiggering at that time too to send everyone from Stratfield to Tomlinson. This proposal that SLAM sent us was not. They said specifically there was something that could be added on to any of the other elementary scenarios that they presented to us. So it was something, we have not discussed it in any real detail. I am interested in looking at it if possible, largely because, I think that for a lot of kids in the Stratfield neighborhood for years, like for a lot of families in the Stratfield neighborhood, it's been, well, we're driving all the way across town, we're driving past 2 other middle schools to get our kids to middle school. The flip side of that you may hear from other board members who have brought this up, is that the plan that SLAM provided to us makes it so that one of the elementary schools is the Singleton, and it will move only just them from one, not with their peers to high school. So, like, these are concerns that we, that are balanced, that we will ultimately need to balance. Now, we're focusing most of our efforts on, is this me? I'm sorry, I don't know if this is, well, I can keep talking, we've been focusing most of our efforts on the elementary school issue. That's the issue that state has asked us to address. But alongside that, we're also trying to see are there other things that we can do? Can we also address utilization issues? Can we also address the ECC? In my mind, it's something that is worth the discussion, but there are clearly 2 sides to that story. But and I will also say that there's a third side. I asked my two younger kids who went to Stratfield and have gone since to Ward, if they disliked going to Tomlinson, because it was a long bus ride and the kids need to get up early, sometimes leave home before the kids going to high school in order to catch the bus. What they told me, in all fairness and complete candor, was that they enjoyed the fact of going to Tomlinson for middle school because after school they could go with their friends and hang out on the post road. So
I think that's actually a great experience for the kids in itself. I just think of it as my husband and I both work outside of the home. Unfortunately, we don't have the luxury of working from home and being able to not have to troubleshoot and start the whole morning routine earlier. And I think of, like, whose kid is not going to forget something at school, and I'm going to have to drive across town to pick up the violin or the notebook for the science test the night before.
Sure.
And come back with everybody doing the shuffle down Fairfield Woods Road 45 minutes later. So I just wasn't sure if it was something that I could look forward to, potentially if I am redistricted to Stratfield, or if it was going to be coming much later down the road.
you could look forward to the discussion.
Okay, I'll take that.
I'm going to follow up on that. A couple points on that. So, for those of you that are not familiar with our whole district, there are kids who already do this now besides what you would be facing. Our district does not have a bus length cap policy, and that would be another way to address this issue, pending transportation issues that we already have. So there are already kids doing what you're describing now. You wouldn't be, the kids, Stratfield kids are not alone in this. There are other kids who, and that is actually their closest one. So just to be familiar that if we're going to be looking at something that's based on bus length or distance, that's going to be for a lot of different schools then, not just a Stratfield per se. Also the Singleton issue, I mean, this was looked at extensively in 2010. There was a whole committee, it was a board committee. There were a lot of meetings on it, and there was some criteria set, which we have not decided upon, haven't had a discussion on the Singleton issue, how would it impact high schools, feeders, etc. So there was a lot of criteria that that board set at that time and that committee, and we have not done that work. So, but like Mr. Peterson said, it was put in there as a tag on. I will say that it would actually work. It's part of a 4, but it was kind of a different scenario. But it would work for several schools actually to fit, whether that be McKinley, whether that be North Stratfield or Burr, whatever. So the numbers actually could work for a number of schools in that scenario, not just at Stratfield. But Mrs. Maxon-Canelli?
But just to follow up, to give you specific information, because obviously right now we have a rather large audience for our meetings, and we anticipate that when this discussion is down, having a smaller audience for our meetings. But just to clarify through the chair, this would be something that could come up as early. The point is, as soon as we take the vote, this should be coming up as a topic for parents to pay attention to shortly thereafter. Does that sound right?
If this board wants to set up a committee or some sort of structure to have the conversation and keep this going on in terms of a redistricting after we've decided on elementary, then yeah, that's something that we can do.
Okay, you said if. We indicated 5 members were indicated in this discussion, so it's not an if, we will be having this discussion.
We can have this conversation. Yes, it's a matter of when do we want to start that conversation, likely with the new board, right?
Right.
Okay, thank you for your time.
I'm Sarah Walker Carpenter of 94 Crest Terrace. Question about the new board, really. This board made the decision to put utilization and the ECC in with the racial imbalance charge. They're both very important topics. They both need to be addressed. But why were they put together with a racial imbalance? Why did you not just address racial imbalance, satisfy the state, and then dig deeper over the years to put together a plan for what the school should look like, where we should build buildings, what schools need to be replaced, how to get air conditioning in the schools? I mean, we may not have the experience that you have, but we are here tonight because we want you to teach us so that we can participate with you in the future. So teach us, tell us why.
Mrs. Gerber.
Well, the board made the decision to not just solely focus on racial imbalance because we knew that we had facilities issues. At the time that we were beginning to discuss this, we were also in tandem discussing the upcoming capital projects at Jennings and Dwight, which have both been waiting for a very long time, very patiently, for renovation and air conditioning. And we know that this board or future boards will have to go before all the other town bodies to present whatever presentation they want in terms of what these projects are going to look like for Dwight and Jennings. And we knew that with these schools being underutilized, that questions would be asked, well, what about facilities utilization? And if we were not able to show that we were, I mean, I will tell you right now, like we've had discussions in the past, going back to like the Mill Hill renovation and expansion, where we had other town bodies saying, well, you're going to need to redistrict. And, you know, that some of these schools are underutilized, others are overcrowded. So that needs to be dealt with as well. So we've been having those discussions for a very long time. And when it became clear that we were going to have to really seriously deal with racial imbalance and not trying to kind of slightly get the needle to move, but really go in, as the State Board of Ed has told us to do, and make some serious changes, we understood that doing that in a silo and not dealing with the facilities utilization issues that were also pressing would be potentially putting us or future boards in the position of 1, 2, 3 years from now having to do another redistricting. And the thought was that, can we just do it all at one time and be able to deal with everything all at once? Obviously, it's, you know, in some ways you could say we bit off more than we can chew, but the intent at the time, and I think still now, is to look at these issues and the ECC as well, because that is also a pressing issue and continues to grow, the need for the ECC space. So instead of saying, first we're going to deal with racial imbalance, then a year or two from now, we're going to have to come before the town bodies for Dwight or for Jennings or for both and make that justification. And we're going to be told you need to change the numbers. Then we're going to go back and redistrict perhaps some of the same kids who have already been moved because of racial imbalance. And then perhaps at some point we're going to have to look at ECC, either with Dwight and Jennings or separately. So then maybe there'd be a third redistricting. Something that I think everyone here in this room and elsewhere would say, we really don't need to do this 3 times or even twice. So that was the motivation behind this board moving in that direction. Even though it is an enormous lift, the intent was to prevent having to go back once or twice, perhaps, to deal with the same issues and perhaps move the same children once or twice more.
Sure, I appreciate the intent, that helps. It feels as though a lot of the issues that we're trying to address all at once are really in conflict with each other because of limited budgets and time and whatever else. Are we at a point yet where the board is going to set a new charge to get through the next month so that it is just racial imbalance and we can table utilization and the ECC, which are so important? I want both of them addressed as well, but it's feeling like we're not getting anywhere, and you all look lovely, but you all look very tired, and I know how hard these meetings are on you guys too. So, like, we're not where you want to be, we're not where we want to be. How are we going to get there in the next 30 days? That's what I think these meetings we're struggling with.
Mrs. Maxon Kennelly.
So I think if you were able to watch the last meeting, I think that was a seismic shift, because I couldn't agree more with how Mrs. Gerber characterized it. We didn't want to do this again, and we had, I mean, utilization, for example, comes with actual academic impact. If a building is getting too, if there are too many children in the building for the classrooms, we're putting art in a cafeteria, we're putting music on a cart. That's and that's just a couple of the ways that it's academically impactful. When you have underutilization, our elementary schools don't function at their best when we only have 2 sections per grade, as an example, in an underutilized school. So that's when you say, please think about our children. We are thinking about the children. So when we were trying to do that, but again, seismic shift at that last meeting of saying sort of what you're saying, which is we've got to take care of the racial imbalance. However, we can't let go of the ECC part of this either, because that's immediate. Mr. Mancusi has spoken to us a few times now about, with the new rule regarding the September 1st enrollment for kindergarten, for example. These are known, this isn't hypothetical, I think it's 40 or 41 children who now will not be moving into our kindergarten, are going to need ECC space. We don't have that space right now to serve them best academically. So no matter what, even if we somehow could postpone racial imbalance, we were going to have to address ECC regardless. So I don't think that we can give up the ECC coupling with the racial imbalance, but we did make the commitment first and foremost to racial imbalance to SLAM, which is a new direction to that point. And I just want to correct Mrs. Gerber on one thing, which is she may use the phrase the expansion of Mill Hill, but as she knows, she alluded to this at the last meeting, and that's where it's easy to just watch Board of Ed meetings and remember that we don't operate in a vacuum here. In fact, they did not expand Mill Hill. They actually, for the first time in my memory, took a building project and reduced the size, and that was done by the Board of Finance, and their feeling, and if I mischaracterize it, I'm sure someone will correct me, they didn't feel that we had made the case that we needed the space that we did. And so by reducing it, now this was with portables, from a 23 classroom school to a 21, we asked for a 24 classroom school. By doing that, reducing, because they felt we hadn't made the case, because we didn't have a redistricting plan already ready to hand them, that's something we're dealing with the repercussions of that right now, of not having that space. So all of these things that, if you're just tuning in, why we're worried about utilization and all of that, it's because there can be a real price to pay when we have a future argument to make. And again, perfect example of why we had to look into a scenario of repurposing or closing a school, because other town boards will say, make the case that you need this space. So that's where there is a lot of backstory to a lot of the discussions that hopefully that wasn't more than what you were looking for.
No, it helps beautifully, and I guess it's just the last question that I wonder, are the other town boards working with you effectively? Because it doesn't seem like it.
Well, just to,
Go ahead, Mr.
oh, no, I was just
Peterson.
going to say, this is our weight to carry. We have been asked by the State Board of Ed to do this. It's not something that the town has either the interest or legal standing to weigh in on. It will come up in our budget for the next fiscal year, which is one of the reasons that we're on this timetable that we're on now, where, you know, central office is already starting to do budgetary work. But this is a decision that we need to make. The disposition of the school district is the Board of Ed's responsibility, not the RTM's, not the First Select Woman's, not the Board of Finance.
But they have to fund the budget that you need to do what you're trying to do.
All correct. I mean, I live in constant hope that other town officials are paying close attention to our meetings. I've had conversations with several other town officials from other bodies that are very interested in getting the most accurate information about what we're doing. So
They're all residents, they should come and sit in.
well, and some have. We've seen members of our state delegation come in too. But as I said, this is our decision to make ultimately.
All right, Mrs. Gerber, I'll let you follow up, and then we'll let, if it's okay. With
Yeah, just really quickly, I mean, I absolutely agree that this is the Board of Ed's responsibility. We are the ones who have to vote on this. But I just think it's important, and I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but, you know, some of these plans would look a lot different with 3 additional classrooms at Mill Hill, and just some of the other decisions that have been made. I just think it's important to realize that. I mean, I know in some ways you think 3 classrooms, how big a difference does that make? But I think it does. I think it can. And I just think it just shows that decisions that are made at the time, I'm sure it seemed perfectly logical to some of the other town bodies. But, you know, obviously we did not know exactly that we would end up in this exact place at this exact moment. But I can tell you right now, we could certainly use those 3 classrooms, and that is the direct result of other town bodies deciding that they knew better than the Board of Education did, because the Board of Ed had unanimously approved an ed spec of 504.
Thank you very much, I appreciate it.
Folks, anyone using the podium, please make sure you speak close into the mic so we can hear you.
Is that okay? Good. Hi, Elisa Gurovich, Roseville Terrace. I have a junior at Ludlow High and a 7th grader at Woods. I'd love a concrete answer on how you will make a decision on grandfathering.
Mrs. Guernsey.
Thank you for asking that question. I love talking about grandfathering, but not all of the members of the board do. They prefer to wait to have that conversation. So I think we're in a place now, from my understanding, that we might never even have that conversation because we could be limited by the buses that are available to us. So there are a lot of questions around this. This is going to happen later. The conversation will happen later.
I'll just follow up that once we hopefully, either next week, preferably, make a kind of big determination on what we're going to have operationalized, we will get information on the numbers of the by grade impact. I don't know, I can't tell you right now what way we would go in terms of figuring out what the numbers would be, but once we know that, then we will have the conversation about how many students that looks like, what the transportation issue is, whether we have to provide transportation or not, things like that, but we will have the conversation at some point. Mr. Peterson.
I just want to add, the transportation thing is not a new theme. This is something that several board members have been talking about for some time. In the Board of Ed Finance Committee, we've been talking about bus driver shortages for a very long time now. In fact, we're having a meeting of that committee tomorrow, at which I asked the superintendent to give us an update on the transportation situation, because in the last full Board of Ed meeting, I believe Mr. Testani said we're 10 bus drivers short of our complement. So I wanted to get more color on that. So that's a thing that I personally have been thinking about when I'm thinking about the grandfathering issue. I think some people believe it's just a finance issue. Just ask for the money that you need. But if we have money that we need and no drivers, then that's the fundamental block that I see us being up against. But it's something that's been threaded through the conversation for a while now.
Yeah, so I can appreciate that. I think my biggest concern with grandfathering, especially with having a junior in high school, is that this takes effect for when she is a senior. And I know, looking at that climate survey at the last meeting, that we have mental health issues within our children. And I definitely do not want to see a mental health crisis with juniors going to be seniors when they have to be moved to a different high school. I would really like a little bit more clarity on the timing of decision-making on grandfathering. Can
Mrs.
someone provide
McIntyre,
that?
go ahead.
I'm going to go way out on a limb here and say I cannot imagine, me speaking by myself, that we would not grandfather seniors. Between letters of recommendation and between everything else, I'm okay. For me, that one grade is the no-brainer. It's everything else we have to figure out. And the one other part of the conversation, which has come up informally, but we don't know more about, is what happens when we get into the realm of parents who are willing and able, which is the challenging part, to drive their child. We haven't had that conversation yet, because otherwise the challenges that Mr. Peterson referenced are very real. You know, we don't want to promise something we can't deliver on. That would be far worse. You know, if we promise, oh, we're going to do this for everybody, and then we truly neither have the money nor the manpower, the person power, the drivers, to do the job.
Then I hope that that information is available when the voting happens, because I would imagine that that would make a very big difference in how people would vote. So is that fair to say that this information will be available when voting starts?
Yes, I mean, you know, I can't predict what's going to happen at the next subsequent 3 meetings or so, but in speaking with the superintendent and leadership of the board, that he would have some time after the September meetings to operationalize things in terms of FTE or movements of program, whatever it may be, and that would be a factor that we would consider at that time. So, yes.
Thank you. And thank you for the comment on the seniors. Appreciate that. Thank you.
My name is Tori Donahue. I live at 1022 Mill Hill Road. I prepared some comments, but I actually think this has shifted what I would like to ask you about. But it's helpful to remember where my mind was in thinking about the best way to use this time. First, just acknowledging your work. If not you, then who? I can imagine being in a process where we don't get to come here or do Zooms. So thank you. Part of my work really in public service, and much more specifically in humanitarian response, which I understand is not related to redistricting, centers on the do no harm principle of essentially refraining from action under the null hypothesis theory that maybe it's actually better than an action that's intended to deliver the services required and has these negative effects. And I've been playing with that in my head, trying to think creatively about what that looks like. One of my questions is, I feel like there's a rumor mill of what goes on if you don't successfully redistrict in a way that complies. And out of curiosity, frankly, I'd love to know what that actually is, maybe like for the record. I can keep going with other questions, but that's sort of my first one when I think of this exercise.
We don't quite know exactly what the state board will do if we do not act in accordance to their direction. I mean, we can guess. We are looking and speaking and trying to seek some legal counsel on what possibilities, but because there is really no precedent for this, it's hard to say how they will react and what actions they will take, which I think is pretty scary to have the unknown of what could potentially be their action taken. At the same time, I think it also sheds a couple of lights on the town of Fairfield as well that I think it's, you know, plays out in the media, which is not always positive, as if the town is not looking to do this because we want to inflict harm on a group of our community members, which I think it's loud and clear from folks at McKinley that they love their school and they prefer to stay in their school, but that's not always the picture that's painted. So It's hard to say what they will do, but all indications are that they have every intention of doing something, but that's kind of unknown.
For those, Mr. Asa had done a really good job at kind of explaining this when Mrs. Vitale and Mr. Asa had been before the board in previous, the State Board of Education previously. But for anyone who's curious or listening now and who didn't listen to that, you can go back to the June 27th recording and listen to Mr. Asa's recap of this. But also you can simply pull up on your phone Connecticut Statute 10-4B. Literally, that is the number, and it's called failure to implement the interest of the states. It's outside of the racial imbalance law. And as someone who had been going up to the subcommittee meetings at the State Board of Education level before they asked us for our amendment, these were the conversations that we were having about bringing a 10-4B, and that's basically saying that we as a board have failed to implement the interests of the states, which is also defined in another statute, but then it gets into an investigation, hearings, ultimately orders to comply and whatnot. If we don't, then you end up in court and that kind of a thing. So if you just want to take, it's pretty short actually to read, so you'll get a better understanding of what that is. But that's when Mr. Testani speaks to we don't know. But that has been mentioned as one of the things that would be possible for them to do. Mrs. Maxon Kennelly.
Mr. Jacobson, I was hoping you could clarify further, because this isn't something that we've solely dealt with as a hypothetical. So in terms of what power they have and what they have explicitly said to us, whether it's the attorney at the state or whatever, who has been a little bit more explicit, I was hoping you could provide more color. And I'm not doing it myself because I wasn't there, so
I don't think the attorney has. I don't know if maybe Mrs. Vitale, before my time, when you guys were involved, I don't know if the attorney had basically said, if you don't do this, we're going to file a 10-4B like that explicitly. I just know that it was something broadly brought up in subcommittee level. So I don't know if Mr. Testani or Mrs. Vitale could speak to Mr. McKeon and the state council better than I could.
No, the state did not tell us what they would do if we did not comply. We, after we went up there last spring, we did meet with them, just asking for guidance and some help for ways of coming in compliance. They did share some options at that time. The board sought legal counsel with our attorney. We consulted with the town attorney. Those two were in agreement, and we were told that we needed to act in good faith. So the board updated our racial balance plan, which included exploration of the magnet school, work around school climate, as well as a redistricting. And we, for the last year, have been attempting to act in good faith, and part of that was community engagement. So I thank you all for, again, joining us tonight. Transparency sometimes gets ugly in terms of these discussions, and it's been difficult for us all, but I think that it is a necessary part of the process. And we'll have to see what comes next. I know that Ms. Jacobson, has been involved in a lot of our meetings with the state as well, and I think that her recap of what's happened at the committee level last year is accurate. And, you heard from the superintendent, so I don't really have anything else to add, but thanks for the question.
Thank you. In that case, moving past just what non-action could potentially look like, but coming back to what does it look like not to necessarily go back to a new set of maps. I do think that something like without being for or against really anything at this point, like something like a magnet school, or when someone started talking about the Greenwich school, just sort of plunging the depths of options that a greater contingent within the community could feel comfortable and happy about, maybe pipe dreaming. I'm just curious if any energy is still being directed to that, like in my own, because I did search 10-4B last week when I heard it at the meeting. I also stumbled on documents. I live near Mill Hill Open Space. There's several giant buildings there and a baseball field, and I was like, let's look into this. I'm just curious how much, yes, thought exercise is still going in a direction that's not a new set of scenario maps of slightly shifted redistrict lines, or maybe none. Maybe that's put to rest.
Mr. Peters.
I think there's a division on the board about about that. We've had pretty frank discussions about this in our recent meetings. From my standpoint, speaking as one of nine, and we'll all speak as one of nine, I've said from the beginning I'd be interested in a magnet school concept. I don't know that I am comfortable rushing a magnet school concept into practice for the sake of not redistricting, because those are kids in the McKinley neighborhood, and since our last meeting, I think the word's gone out to a lot of McKinley families, and we've gotten a lot of emails from McKinley families saying, please do not change our school into a magnet. Of the idea that, like, my kid might not want a STEAM magnet school and I might have to move them to another school. I'm concerned about it largely on a timeline basis. I'm not concerned about it on a conceptual basis. And that's where the collision is for me. Other members, I think, are still willing to explore options. I'm certainly open to the idea of, I've not taken a vote on this yet. I'm trying to keep my mind open about it. That's the thing that concerns me primarily about it. Is I don't see it as a solution to the issue. I see it as placing an undue impact on a single community, and this is a community that is, one of the least affluent and more minority-heavy communities in our town. I don't know they should bear the entire brunt of that entire weight of the issue.
I'm just going to piggyback on Mr. Peterson's comment and say I understand that perspective, but I also understand that if we don't consider it now, it would go back to Mrs. Gerber's point of a second redistricting. So either we either fill that space in, even if it doesn't launch now, or we don't, because in order to then make the space, in order to conceptually do a magnet, if it were to be anywhere after we've already redistricted, might spawn some sort of another redistricting. So I know it's frustrating that we've put so many ingredients in the pot, but I think that we've tried to explain why we're doing this primarily so that we can do it once, hopefully, and solve as many of the issues long-term as we possibly can, although it makes it, to Mrs. Gerber's point, a much heavier lift to do so. So I do continue to be interested in a magnet program and in trying to address this through a more voluntary basis. But I do appreciate the concern that it may not work, and also given a lot of the emails, it doesn't indicate a large interest in moving, except unless it's somebody else who would be doing the moving. There is a lot of that. So I do understand Mr. Testani's and some board members' concerns on it. I also know that sometimes, you gotta try to fail and see, and that's just part of life. But I understand both sides of the coin on this, and including the McKinley community. Unfortunately, McKinley is the school that is on the list, and that's how the state lists them. So it's not our view of that, understandably. So did you have a follow-up, Mr. Testani?
The only thing I would add is I come from a district where there are magnet schools, both inter and intra-district, that are successful to some extent. In terms of the inter-district, they have to come up with a plan annually to address racial imbalance. The opposite way than we're trying to, because it relies on children coming from other communities to go to the school. Initially, it wasn't a problem, but after several years, as other school districts create programs, as this one would, it does make it less attractive. Not less successful, but just less attractive. In all the other scenarios, including that one, I will say, it's a school that opens as a separate building. It's not repurposing where the successes have been had. So similar to looking for an ECC site, you wouldn't have the issues that we currently face with trying to tell McKinley, you're impacted only. We're going to move your children out to make room for the possibility of others. It would be opening a new school where there's a lot of excitement and everybody opts in through the lottery process, where I've seen the only successes that are long-term sustainable.
Thank you. And just to leave you with my best thinking, I wasn't particularly interested in the magnet school, but just the notion that a plan going forward might rely on more than the shifting lines of the current 11 districts, something that just kind of shakes the pot in a whole new way, which is why I mentioned the Greenwich thing or that building off that street. But just really, I was curious about the creativity. So I think that's everything. Thank you so much.
No button. Hi, I'm Jackie Bardenwerper, 35 South Benson Commons. I apologize, I'm getting to the meeting late, coming from Sherman Open House, so I apologize if this has been asked before. But I know you guys ended the meeting last week saying you were asking SLAM for a plan that gets under 21% with the racial imbalance. And I'm just wondering what happens if they come back to us and they are not under 21% with Plan 4C. What are the next steps the board's looking to take?
Oh, sorry, Mrs. McMcKenna.
I'm going to punt quickly. And that's why I'm going to defer to Mr. Testani. Did you get any initial sense from SLAM that they would be able to do this with our having removed? I mean, with no more direction than that. We don't know anything. There's no secret information, but that with our having removed some of the strictures that were handcuffing them, did they give you the sense that they will be able to come up, whether we like it or not is another matter, but that we would be able to meet that target?
Yes, they feel that they can hit the 21 or below percentage. I'm not sure which schools are the combination of ECC. That was going to take a little bit more work, but they did feel as if they could make it work to get under 21%, 21 or under.
Okay, and that was taking out the ECC requirements of keeping those clusters of classrooms?
No, actually keeping the clusters.
Keeping the clusters, okay.
Yes.
That's good.
I think it was removing the utilization being as strict a requirement and
Correct.
also giving them more latitude to select the ECC sites.
Correct, okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Random Road, I'm an NSS parent. To piggyback on those questions, when does SLAM owe you that 4C?
In preparation for the next board meeting on the 12th.
The 12th?
Yes.
And at what point I know you guys mentioned making decisions in the coming week. At what point does financial start playing into this?
Soon after the 12th, if the board decides that they want to look at in depth one of the scenarios as to consider what the implications would be on budget.
And so after the 12th, is the decision to vote on a plan and proceed forward? I know we have a ticking clock here.
There won't be a vote on the 12th because we're going to get preliminary information on these new scenarios on that day. It won't be a full package of information because we've given them a really short period of time. So we'll probably just get like the elementary utilization maps, the racial imbalance chart, not any of the middle or high school stuff and all of that. So we would, if the board likes enough, one of what comes to us on the 12th, then we would ask for them to build the full package. So we have all of the information that we need. Can look at that on the 26th, and if we move forward, give Mr. Testani a couple weeks to operationalize everything. Come back on the 10th. I do have space reserved for the 17th because we do need to have a first read and then a vote by on the 24th. At least that's that's in here.
It's good on
but right, exactly. So, and I appreciate the fact that even 2 weeks for the superintendent would be a short amount of time. But at least, and of course, it would only be an estimate. You're never going to have a budget until they actually do the budget. But hey, this won't work because we're going to need 15 more bus runs, or it will, we're okay. You know, just things like that, getting some information. Because obviously, if we're going to vote on something, I think that the board and the community would expect us to have some idea on budget impact and just feasibility operationally. So that's kind of the timeline we're thinking.
That seems very quick, and I hope it works out, but there seems to be a lot of divide and or differing opinions on various details of the plan. How does that play out or play into that scenario where we do have a hard line that we owe the state something?
What do you mean? Well, I mean, if we've come to a place where we're going to vote on the 24th, something will pass or it won't.
And no action, as we talked about, is a tricky balancing act.
Well, I'll get technical. We already voted to take action by the end of October, so it doesn't have to be on the 24th. It can be on the 25th, 26th, 27th, 28th, I mean, whatever it may be. Or there can be action to change the action. So just or our word also, just so only speaking for myself. We gave our word. We took a vote. We took that plan to the state and said, this is what we're going to do. We can change that, but we have to change that. It can't just be like, we don't know what we're doing now. Like, an action would need to undo the previous action, so to speak. So, and my intent is that, you know, Fairfield keeps its word in some sense, and that action is action. I can't tell you if something will pass or not, obviously, can't speak for anyone else on the board. But it's important to me anyway that we, as a district and with the superintendent, keep to our word on doing something in the timeline that we did. Even if that's, we've done it our best shot and we just aren't in a place to actually move something forward, but at least we have done what we said we would do.
Appreciate that, and I appreciate all of your time.
Thanks.
Good evening, David Krasnoff, 155 Burr Street. First of all, thank you guys. I know it's been pretty long back and forth thing going on. But I do have a question, and it kind of piggybacks what everyone's thinking. Where are we? Where are we?
Anyone else want to answer that? Yeah, thanks, Mrs. Max.
I think there is an awful lot of hope riding on what comes next. I think we believe that there have been some communication issues. There have also been some idealization on our part that something could be achieved and it ended up being too restrictive, but that having removed some restrictions, having communicated more explicitly what we're looking for, I'll again speak for myself, I'm very hopeful that what comes next is workable. I'm not saying that what we get is a, you know, final deal. Obviously, there's a lot that has to come with it, but that's where I would say I am. I'm not going to say where we are, but I would say it's with a lot of hope that what comes next is going to finally be what we can work with.
So if you don't like what comes next, are we going to watch other scenarios like 1A and things that were kind of scrapped by the board come back up? Because I did sit at a meeting that utilization was a big concern, but last meeting, once again, 1A came up, and I don't think that's fair to the Jennings community and to the town as a whole, saying one thing that it's a utilization problem and then bringing it back up as a solution. So is that where we're gonna go if it doesn't work? Or is it, you know, we're hoping 4C works, and if it doesn't, we'll look at other options of 4 or maybe something else, or maybe punt to a new board? I don't know, I'm wondering where we're at.
I'll just finish. Here's what I'd say. I hadn't been in favor of 1A. I had not been in favor of 3. 4 as it currently is, 4B was a non-starter. That said, I think in all fairness, you know, we had started out back with Dr. Jones slamming the door closed when she brought up the idea of sister schools. That was a non-starter. If you're going to do it to 2 schools, you're doing it to everybody. And that was where we were philosophically. I think this process has taught, and that's why it's messy, but what this process has certainly shown is that sometimes something that at the moment, and again, I'm not saying I'm in favor of it, I'm saying I do understand why some things came back up, because what absolutely was a, no, I reject that, I'm not in favor of that, suddenly when you realize that the silver bullet is not presenting itself, you need to sometimes take a second look. And maybe upon taking that second look, it only reaffirms, no, we did the right thing the first time. But if nothing else, I would hope that the conversation at that last meeting shows the public how transparent we are trying to be. That last meeting was messy. And it was all out there for everybody here to see. Why? Because we are not having behind the scenes conversations. We're not trying to sew this up and be able to come out to the public and say, hey, this is a great idea, we're gonna do this. Meanwhile, we've already hashed it out behind closed doors. We're doing it here in front of you. And sometimes that might involve someone saying, you know, I know we rejected this idea, but what do you think about this now? Now that we've seen, again, I know I'm repeating myself, now that we've seen there's no silver bullet, maybe some things that we thought were bad aren't so bad anymore. So I'm saying that as a global. I'm not saying that about any specific plan coming back up. I am saying I understand why it happened last meeting, though. Because, again, we are trying to stick to principles, and that's an important guiding part about this. But we want to do this right. And as I said, that's why last meeting got messy.
Mr. Talley, thanks.
I just want to remind everybody that no matter what scenarios we're talking about, they're unfair to someone's community. I mean, every single one of them. And the vast majority of emails we get really are, you know, not the most pleasant emails telling us that we're irresponsible for thinking about one plan versus another because it affects someone else's kid, or they'd rather affect someone else's kid than their kid. And those are the arguments as a board member when you're thinking about utilization issues and the ECC and racial imbalance. You have to look at what's best to solve all three of those if that's what we said we would do. So yeah, I do think that any of the other scenarios could come back up. I don't know that we'll agree on it. I don't know that there'll be a vote for it. But I think it's a good reminder for everybody to know that there is not one scenario that is not going to be, you know, it's not going to affect somebody's community more than another. It's a reality, and it's unfortunate, and it's messy, and it is what it is.
I 100% agree, and the ECC is extremely important, but to do it at the risk of overcrowding all the other schools, I think is irresponsible. That's just my opinion. But regardless of that, I do have another question. So Mrs. Gerber kind of alluded to it today. The Dwight and Jennings conversation has been going on for a very long time. I do know as part of the redistricting, I don't say people hope that one of the schools would close, but I think that was a lean that some people were doing. That's, again, my opinion. But what has been done looking at those two schools, besides just repurposing it as an ECC? I did sit through a November, I believe it was 30th meeting last year, when the Board of Finance, Ms. Carlton and Mr. Walsh were sitting there and literally asking what is the plan for these schools, and to please include that in the redistricting conversation, because possibly that could help the solution and maybe take the burden off of moving all these kids. Was any of that ever discussed?
Mrs. Vitale.
Are you talking about the capital planning?
Correct.
All right, so that meeting, I took that to mean when we're talking about redistricting, is Dwight going to be part of the equation or not? And if it's not, well, that obviously impacts the maps. Same thing with Jennings, our two smallest schools. And I think you're probably right. I think that's, and I know you're right, because this board wanted to do our due diligence too and answer that question, 10 or 11 elementary schools. You know, we're take our responsibilities as fiscal stewards, you know, to heart. And that was an important question that we needed to have answered. I took that to mean just that. All right, if you know after going through this work that you're going to be operating 11 elementary schools, what does that mean? And what does that mean to your capital planning? Because we, as a board, moved air conditioning forward. We put the high school air conditioning on the waterfall. It wasn't even there. And as a result, at the time, Jennings and Dwight got moved back. And part of that was done not because we were any less committed to the work that needs to be done at both of those buildings, but there's just the reality that there's only so much money to do this work.
I mean it just more in terms of space. So if there's a project at these schools, space could be created, which possibly could alleviate some of the redistricting handcuffs that seem to be presented by SLAM.
Well, we did ask that as part of our original charge, to put it to SLAM. And they did not come back with adding space to a building as part of any of the scenarios. And I think that that's work that, this board and the next board are definitely going to have to dive into. As everybody said, it's been messy. We've heard concerns about a more centralized one ECC. We're going through the heat. Air conditioning is, a concern. Ms. Jacobson participated in the capital planning workshop for this year, and it came up again in terms of, what are we going to do? Again, the 12.5 million was a rough estimate that the Board of Education in the town was given for capital projects. Right now, when we're working with that, there's only so much you can do when you have boilers and roofs and bathrooms. But I think that the fact that we haven't decided, in part, was that we were being methodical in our approach. How many buildings? Having these discussions, where are the kids going to be? And then going in and getting a harder look at what the cost will be. Because, if 1A, and I'm not advocating for anything, but if it were to move forward as an ECC, potentially that renovation might look different than what you need to do to that building than if it was, continuing to house full elementary school. If you were going to move forward with a magnet programming, I'm not even going to say at McKinley, at any school, that might require a renovation of space if you were going to have specialized an auditorium for arts or science labs for STEAM. So I think that, I know it's not fast enough, but I think that these conversations we're having now are going to help inform the next round.
Well, what I was saying, for example, let's say Dwight was to be slated for a rebuild, which people at Dwight know it's in pretty rough shape, and you were to decide that's a good home for the ECC down the road, wouldn't this whole movement of ECCs kind of be for nothing because it will end up in its own site maybe in 5-6 years, and then possibly would have to move some kids back into the schools?
I don't want to answer that because the full board hasn't had that discussion. I think the first thing we had to know was how many buildings are going to be in play. And then also, how much money potentially is going to be in play over the next 5 to 10 years.
I'm going to let Mrs. Maxon.
And just one more, and getting more feedback from the administration on our ECC programming, which I think that I know I've asked for just in terms of demographics. What do we think, population changes? Is it this whole legislation? That's new just this year. Universal pre-K. There's more that needs to be discussed. And this board will do it, or the next board will do it.
Sorry, I'm going to let Mrs. Maxon Kennelly follow up and then let someone, thank you.
What I'd also say is that it is unfortunate that we can't dream and have a vision to a degree which we know is utterly subject to the whim of other boards. That's not how we do building projects. We now have this building project before us. We go into the ed specs, we vote on the ed specs, and it moves down the line to other town boards. So we can't start planning on anything, and I'm not going to keep repeating this, but I remind you, we thought Mill Hill should be a 504. We thought that was a done deal. It was appropriate. And then it didn't happen because of the will of another town board, which had its own reasons for making that move. But if we started trying to make a plan where it was counting on, well, let's think long-term. Let's think what's going to happen with Jennings and Dwight. We would be lying to the public if we gave them some false hope that we in any way thought we could count on that actually being the reality when we haven't done the work of the ed specs. We have not brought it before. We don't bring building projects before the Board of Finance for a project 5 years down the road. That's just not that's not our process. And so while we dream lots of ideas about these buildings, it just wasn't a practical part of this process.
I'm just going to leave it at this. I think that's why everyone wants the Board of Ed and the Board of Finance to maybe talk a little bit more. That's it. Thank you so much.
Get your steps in.
My name's Emma Burnett. I live at 24 Cambridge. I just had a quick question in regards to when the charge is being given to SLAM to make these new maps, is busing a consideration that they're looking into? I'll just preface that by, and it's nobody's fault, but the buses have been a mess this week. My 4-year-old attends the ECC. He was on the bus for an hour and a half, 2 days last week. He should have a 15 to 20-minute bus ride. My daughters are walkers. But I've heard from friends who attend our school, we're at Sherman, that the buses also were kind of a mess. And I guess my question is, now that the handcuffs have been taken off and that walkers kind of got deprioritized, is SLAM looking at those numbers, or do they just send the percentages and then the board has to look at those numbers? I mean, I just think that's something that really needs to be considered. And I appreciate anything you have on that.
They are looking at the walking zones. That's on every map as they work through it. They've showed Angeles and I, they have the walking zones all mapped out in proximity to the school. They want to preserve those walking zones because they understand the hardships that will create to the district if they increase bus routes.
Okay, appreciate it. Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
I'm just going to follow up with that really quickly to make sure that people understand that when we say walk zones, that means that you don't choose to walk. That means that you are not eligible for the bus.
Good evening, everybody. Peter Saluk, 321 Judd Street. The last meeting brought up a lot of emotions. I have a few questions. One, a lot of the plans we've seen move Holland Hill students to McKinley and vice versa. And those are the schools with the most diversity. How do you see that fixing a diversity issue? You know, I don't see anybody else being as affected as those two schools.
What scenario are you speaking about?
I'm sorry, scenario 4 specifically.
I don't have that.
Well, let it be a rhetorical question. Then my second question is that even if that does go through, this becomes a Band-Aid, right? Because clearly, as soon as those homes become eligible for a specific school that somebody wants to move to, people are going to make those decisions. So, seeing as the community, through about 5 or 6 meetings, has shown a displeasure for pretty much every single issue or option that has been presented, and you've presented what would happen if the 1004B would happen, have you reached out to the community that maybe we would want that to happen, right? Like maybe we would want to actually go into the courts and fight with the state directly, rather than have these meetings that might affect some folks, not all folks, and we would actually go to battle with the state against a law that is just antiquated at this point, without any real results in place. I mean, I would much rather. And also, is there any way that we can help you, right? Because the state's going to get hit with class action suits no matter what, like whatever happens. So I guess my question to you is, have you reached out to the public to actually see that they might prefer a 1004B to be enacted?
If you're asking if duly elected Board of Education members who have taken an oath to uphold all laws of the state and the federal government, if they've actively gone out to the community to ask if they would support us in breaking the law, I personally haven't taken that action. So I think we need to just be clear that you can do what you want. We are an elected agent of the state, as well as representatives of the community, but to fulfill federal and state law regardless. We don't have the authority to say, well, we don't like your law, whatever the law may be, so we're just not going to do that. And you know what? You go ahead. I understand the appeal of that. I understand that. Whether any one of us individually agree or disagree with this law or what we're being asked to do it, I've been on record certainly plenty of time about what the etiology of this issue is and why are we the ones who are addressing it, right? Okay. However, let's be careful in the sense that, at least for my own self, and I'll let other board members speak, if the superintendent were to send out a survey and say, should the board and the district violate the law, not really sure that would go over too well. We have previous leadership, this leadership, the superintendent, we are in constant communication and meetings and trying to advocate for this community, explained so many different issues pertaining to this and the way that we see it. The law is the law. You, if you would like to take a different action as private citizens, are perfectly within your purview to do that.
Okay, thank you. I guess my last question is, you mentioned that the board has already voted to take action at the end of October, or whenever you decided to do that, but that you could potentially vote to change that action. What would it take for you to change that action?
Action. So like a vote. Go ahead,
Please.
Mrs. Maxon Canelli.
So what that's a specific reference to is we had to put together a since we were first identified as being racially imbalanced, we as a board have had to, well, staff has created, we've tweaked, we have voted on a racial imbalance plan. So this is going back to before 2010. And every so often, we have had to submit amendments to that plan. So the most recent version of that plan that we voted on indicated that we would be taking this vote. So that's what Mrs. Jacobson is referencing when she said, if we were to vote to change the racial imbalance plan, which then has to go to the state for approval. I'm not saying what we're doing or not, but that's the specific document that Mrs. Jacobson is referencing, where we as a board, by voting to approve the racial imbalance amendment, we were indicating that we would be taking that vote by the end of October. That's the idea.
Got it. Okay. One last comment, and not really a question, but my understanding is that the reason for all this redistricting is racial imbalance, but the question of the ECC and utilization is something that the board would just like to do as a part of it, and it seems to be disrupting a lot more students and families than it actually helps, at least from you know what I've seen from the plans. Obviously, the new 4C or whatever we're going to call it may or may not change that, but I would ask the board to just, you know, in that case, keep the charge to redistricting only and worry about the utilization and ECC under a separate agenda. Thank you.
Just before the next member comes up, if you can, as you're making your way on down, just a hands of how many more people are going to plan on speaking, just so I can monitor the time that we go on. Hi, please. Okay, all right.
Good evening, Alyssa Kent, 186 White Oak Road. First, just going to start with the statement. And my kids move in 9 of 10 of these scenarios. I am not asking for a map that doesn't move my kids. I'm asking for a map that keeps communities together, that doesn't gerrymander districts, that keeps kids with a few peers, and results in a supported transition. And my biggest concern is that we're very far away from those very basic requirements for those of us that, you know, are really absolutely getting moved. So that leads me to the next thing, which is, it feels like there is some bias in the communication to SLAM. I think it was kind of shocking last week when we heard the consultant talk about focusing on certain schools. And then we have the memo come out today, which has additional information that's beyond what the school size and bathrooms and things like that are. There was notation about certain schools being at capacity when other schools were at higher or the exact same capacity that didn't have that same notation. So whether intentional or not, it feels like there's some bias and there's some influence on the charge to the consultant. And that seems like something that should get straightened out like right away. That 4C comes out with a completely very descript, the consultant should be the one fact-finding. They should be the one that is given the school information and can decipher the information from there. So that's just an observation, a frustration on behalf of myself and some other people.
So the Mill Hill, Sherman, there's no space available moving out. That's the feedback from SLAM. That's not going to SLAM, that's coming from SLAM. That's why it was included in the memo. So the challenge for them is they have to move large groups of students out of those schools, which would create large transportation issues for the district. So that's the feedback that was given toward those schools.
Sure, but what about Osborne Hill and I forget which else, North Stratfield? Those have at higher current capacities.
Well, Stratfield has, it says here, we can leave the ECC there.
No, North Stratfield. I guess it was unclear from your memo today. I thought that was the memo from the board going to SLAM.
No, this is from me to the board, to the board members from me.
Okay.
So that is after speaking with SLAM and having conversations. That is what the feedback was, so.
Okay.
I'll just piggyback that from the making of the sausage meeting, that was a little bit of messy.
Yeah.
It was really clear that we didn't have a really good lay of the bathroom situation in terms of the ECC plus the facility, what would be needed between, you know, our director of facilities and our director of special ed. So I think there was actually inquiry by the board to get a really clear understanding of where we are with the bathrooms.
Sure.
I mean, it's like bathrooms and busing is like determining.
No, understood. Yeah. So I think that leads to my next point, which is that there still doesn't seem to be clear understanding of our facilities. So currently we have ECC classrooms at Stratfield School. We have kindergarten classrooms without bathrooms. We have second graders on the second floor. So if those are things that we're going to accept, then we should communicate those things to SLAM. Those are things that we accept. If we are getting feedback saying we're no longer going to accept those things, then we should change them, and they should be changed now, and that should be very clear to the consultant. Because those change the scenarios drastically when we're using the ECC 5 rooms at different schools as a big driver for what's going to happen in 4C. And it doesn't feel like we have that nailed down right now. I think earlier tonight we were talking about there's nobody in second grade on the second floor, and my son goes up the stairs to second grade starting last week. So that's just, you know, I think we have some further refinement to do on facilities. The next thing is I just wanted to get a little more creative, and I want you guys to think, as 4C comes along, two things. Math Academy, bring it back to a homeschool. You know, what do those demographics look like at McKinley School? It's just like any other special programming. Does it get us below 25%? If so, bring it back, expand it to third grade. It was hugely successful. Why aren't we looking at it?
So given the demographics of the students that from last year and this year, it would actually increase the racial imbalance, not decrease.
Yeah. So to that point, we also need to be looking at what the racial imbalance was at Holland Hill. I think I did this in a couple meetings ago, what that looks like, and make sure that our data is correct when we pulled the Math Academy out of Holland Hill, that we didn't change the racial imbalance there. The last thing I want to talk about is if we're really talking about equity across the entire district, one opportunity for really bringing equity to the entire district and grandfathering as many students as possible is expanding the walker zone to the state guidelines, which is 1 mile. Fairfield currently walks at 3/4 of a mile. I think you cover a whole lot of ground when you expand that to 1 mile, and talk about a place where we could really, everybody sort of picks it up and carries it together, and we get through this as a town together. And either at the end of those 6 years, we save a huge amount on busing, or at the end of those 6 years, we, reduce it back to 3/4 of a mile, and the biggest net impact is everybody gets a little more exercise. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, it's definitely something that I brought up outside of this conversation years ago, budgetary. I think the board has also talked about this, and I don't know if Mr. Peterson, you've talked about it in finance, but it's something that I think just regardless of this situation, but inclusive of, is looking at the Walker guidelines, at least at the elementary level possibly. But I can't tell you right now if that would save any money. I have no idea.
But would you consider that as within the grandfathering discussion?
Mrs. Maxon, can I?
Do you mean as a way to help pay for grandfathering?
So it opens
Because so that we reduce the number of buses we need.
You reduce the number of seats that are needed on buses, and you can therefore grandfather. And then probably a lot of those people that need to be grandfathered are walkers and don't need transportation at either of the schools that they would be going to.
So I think what I would say to that is I think we are going to have an extremely robust discussion on grandfathering, and my reason for resisting it up until now is we needed to know what plan we were talking about. So I think the moment we start feeling like this is what we're narrowing in on, because we have so many ideas from the public, I think there are a lot of ideas represented up here on the board of things we want to look into. I don't think anyone's closed the door on any particular idea because there's too much we don't know. But once we get into it, I think we have a lot. I think staff is going to unfortunately get extremely busy with all of the questions, exactly like something like what you just said of, well, what about this? Well, what about that? And by doing this, would it help us in this? We have a lot to talk about with that, which is again why I am very hopeful that come the 12th, we have some, because I've heard from you in the past regarding, we have the whole transition piece to work on. And that's both in sending schools, receiving schools. There's so much to do with that so that parents' concerns can be at least somewhat allayed. I think that all receiving schools, we would challenge them, and I have no doubt they're going to rise to the challenge of how do we welcome our new students, and they need as much advance lead time on that as possible. So there's certainly a lot we need to do, and a lot is riding on next Tuesday and where we go from there.
Sorry, that's okay. The only thing I would add about the grandfathering everyone, I mean, I know nobody wants to hear it, but I'm not in favor of that, if for no other reason. I'm not saying I don't want to grandfather anybody. I mean, I think I stand with Ms. Maxon Kennelly on seniors. In my mind, it is a no-brainer, but I'm not ready to have this conversation. My opposition, mostly to just blanketly saying we can grandfather everyone, is almost the same rationale as when we were talking about a phase-in of a magnet school. It's not going to move the needle in year one. If we grandfather everyone now, we're talking 5 years to really move the needle, to do what SLAM wants to achieve. And that says nothing also of any sort of utilization, because what if people, some choose to go and some people don't? Now, do we have too many kindergarteners or not enough? Because some people decided to stay, or not kindergarten, bad example, but third graders. So again, I think the conversation's premature, but I don't think grandfathering everyone, just from a mere transportation standpoint is feasible, and also just, it's not going to move the needle in year one at all if everyone just stays where they were.
Right, but the state doesn't require us to move the needle in year one, correct?
I can't even speak to that. I just know that we spoke at the table as a board when we talked about the magnet school, and I believe the consensus was that the state was looking for immediate numbers and not necessarily would be happy with the phase-in.
I'll defer to Mr. Testani on this, but they are definitely looking for action starting in the 24-25 school year of something, whether or not, if we decided to go with the phased-in approach, let's say hypothetically for any chance, whether or not they would be okay with that or not, I certainly can't speak to, but definitely something has to happen next year.
Yeah, I'm not under the impression they're willing to wait 6 years to see if we did anything of any substance, or more. But it's a tough predicament. I mean, just, I know people feel anxious, people are angry, no matter what, as this discussion drags out, I can see it, I feel it, but I can assure you there's no, from my end, in this report, there is no bias. I have no skin in the game when it comes to particular schools and who can be touched or not touched. I just want to make sure that all the kids, at the end of the day, when this is all completed, to your point, that we create a plan to make sure that every transition that occurs, just like we do from 8th to 9th, 5th to 6th, students that move, students with IEPs, that we can do and create a plan that makes sure that every child gets what they need in order to be successful in the school. But in terms of any bias, I think that's ludicrous. I mean, I don't see that happening, I don't think.
Yeah, just for the record, and I know my time is up, I was not suggesting that it was bias coming from you. I'm suggesting that we all have our individual biases based on our own neighborhoods and our own positions within this process. And when the board doesn't give explicit direction that comes from the entirety of the board, that's where biases come in that don't reflect the whole decision of the board. And I apologize, I did not mean that to be directed at you.
Part of the problem is when we meet with SLAM and they're showing us the maps and where the concentration of students are, and students, unfortunately, that are causing the imbalance at McKinley, moving those students is tricky. I've learned a lot in the process about how they approach their work. Some people talk a little bit about the funny, jagged mapping of it. They don't want to do that, but they're trying to grab students and put them somewhere without impacting the walkers. That makes sense. And this puzzle, where the schools are located, where the people are located, it doesn't match up in a clean way. And unfortunately, to the mom who said her child was on the bus to the ECC for over an hour, that's something we try to avoid as well. So there are certain locations of the town that are just much more difficult to get to. During the course of the day, it becomes difficult. This morning, going to work, Fairfield Woods Road was backed up all the way down to Stratfield Road. Trying to get from one school to the next was almost impossible.
Okay, thank you.
This mic. Good evening, Michelle Walker, 127 Blue Ridge Road. And I think most of the people on the board know that I, as the McKinley BOE rep, have spoken against the idea of a magnet school at McKinley as a solution to address racial imbalance. It's not a fear around being innovative, it's a fear that this approach is just not in the best interest of the McKinley community. Just a simple drive around town will tell you that the town wants walkers to stay walking, to protect neighborhood schools and save Jennings, to save one school, save all schools. I'm not hearing a desire for opening a magnet or a wish to leave a neighborhood school to attend a magnet. And so I'm just wondering, are you? Because I'm surprised it continues to come up in these discussions when, as a McKinley parent of 3 kids in the school, it seems like a huge risk and not a very willing public. But I don't know all the emails that you get, so I was just curious if you're hearing differently, and I would like to know.
We have gotten hundreds of emails, and I think one, correct me if I'm wrong, came from someone who said they don't have a kid in the system yet, but would consider the idea of a magnet school. After the last meeting, when there was kind of a call to action of, hey, if you really want a magnet school, this is your opportunity to come to the community conversation or send your emails to your Board of Ed reps. I'd argue that we got probably more emails against the magnet school than for. So it was a resounding message, at least in my inbox, against the magnet.
I'm just asking because I hear from the McKinley community primarily, so I don't know everyone's email, but every time I hear it come up again and again, and it just seems like there's not a lot of support for it. So I'm just in the community.
Mrs. Guernsey.
I've advocated for the magnet school in the past. I've sort of changed my tune slightly about that because I actually have grown sort of distance from the idea of magnet, and that maybe we should be looking at specialized programming. I acknowledge the hurt that this has caused to the McKinley community, and it was never my intention to take away any of the celebration of the spirit of that community. So that being said, I think it's a little bit unfair to ask the community to embrace a concept that has not been built yet. So just, giving that some space to sort of grow. And, I was excited by the concept of it. Again, moving away from magnet, maybe it's a specialized program, maybe it doesn't get housed in McKinley. I don't know what it looks like. Maybe it's multiple magnet schools. I'm really interested in what that can do to enhance our district and our program and enhance the experiences of our students at McKinley School. So that was what I was trying to convey with the idea of magnet, not that I thought that it would take away from the wonderful community that you have. Obviously, you've heard from a lot of people from McKinley, and I just kind of wanted to clarify some of those points for you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mrs. Vitale.
Being that I did have brought up the magnet program multiple times, and in part it is in our plan, and I think that this board needs to do due diligence. And at the beginning of this conversation, I can't tell you how many people, what about a magnet? What about a magnet? What about a magnet? Have you thought about a magnet? Why aren't you talking about a magnet? Why are you going straight to redistricting? Which is why I brought it up, because we're going through all these meetings. Let's put it all out on the table and let's have the discussion. I agree with Ms. Guernsey just in terms of I don't think that we really even brainstormed of what that might look like. We haven't done a survey of the community to see what kind of programming you might send. I'm not even, and I totally agree that if you have a child right now that's in 3rd grade, that's already in their school, the chances are probably pretty slim that you are going to want to move them out of that school. The thing that got me about this magnet as it was first introduced was the phased-in approach, because we could build it and it was attractive to me, and I'm repeating myself. 1, because I think it lessens the budget implication on year 1. 2, everybody stays where they are. This population of kids that have lived through a pandemic, 4, in the McKinley community that we have all advocated for, that we all love, will stay together. I mean, I think that just being realistic here, the imbalance is at that school. So that community, no matter what plan comes before us, is going to change. And selfishly, I think that it bought us some time, because I'm feeling under the gun a little bit, to have the discussion. And to Ms. Guernsey's point, maybe not a magnet, maybe it's a earlier start day, maybe an ECC. We just didn't really talk about it. So it was in no way trying to eliminate, thinking, oh, let's just get rid of that school completely and solve our problem. It was an opportunity just to have the discussion with the community. We've been meeting a lot with this board, and for no other reason to say it was part of our plan. We did our due diligence, check, and now we need to move on, and that's it. So my apologies to anyone in the McKinley community that took it as anything other than that. To the teachers, it was not meant to diminish anybody's work. But I do get excited when I think about what possible new programming that we could bring to this district. And now is an opportunity. But as Ms. Kelly said, we got a lot of emails against and not too many for at this point. So thank you for reaching out and representing your community.
I try. All right, thank you very much. So are we moving kind of forward from the original plan, or?
I mean, it doesn't sound like anyone on this board really is looking forward to move forward with the magnet program right now.
Okay, thank you.
Speaking for myself, my read on the rest of my colleagues.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hi, Josh Giordano, 370 High Ridge Road. One thing I didn't hear is, have we put a limit on the number of scenarios that we're expecting?
Mrs. Guernsey.
I love that question because at one of our last meetings, I asked Mr. Testani if he thought we were going to be receiving more than one, and the answer was a resounding no. But I invite him in case he has other feedback about that.
No, it's just a side-by-side comparison between which schools would best fit the 2 additional ECC sites outside of Ward. But other than that, there is no plan for another, well, unless they ask for another 4X or Y, I don't know.
So if that's a side-by-side compare, then wouldn't that indicate that there would need to be some sub-scenarios within that? Because that would have an impact on the number of students that might need to be moved?
Well, they'll both be there. Both, you'll be able to see for the elementary. It won't project out the middle and high school. They won't have time to do that, but it will project. You'll be able to see if you utilized just elementary school A and B or B and C. There's only a few, so they're going to do Holland Hill and another and Jennings and another because they think those are the 2 best, but they don't. Holland Hill and Jennings is not, doesn't work because of the close proximity and moving kids. You can't accomplish what they need.
Mrs. Maxon County.
So just to be clear, to answer the question, we are getting 2 more scenarios. Again, not fully fleshed out, but we are getting 2 more so that we can see these 2 ECC impacts on racial imbalance and a redistricting plan versus these 2. So we are getting 2 more.
I think we're all excited about that. Specifically, can you each articulate, or a few of you, the specific criteria that you're using to determine what you're voting yes on for the following plan? And if possible, like a prioritized order, I think that'd be helpful for the community.
Mrs. Kelly.
I think we kind of did that at the meeting as far as racial imbalance, ECC location, and that was kind of the bigger priorities there. I personally have a priority of seeing, I don't want to see groups of 7 kids moved. I want to see larger peer groups moved. I don't think it's fair, or to quote a lot of the emails that we've gotten, I think it's inhumane to ask 7 children to move out of a school so that everybody else doesn't have to. I think it's inhumane to have that conversation with your child. You can look at the maps and say, oh, this is a great scenario because my street's not on there, and you can put it down and you can walk away. There's across town, there's somebody else having that same conversation going, oh my God, how am I going to explain to my kid that he or she and only 6 of her other friends are leaving and everybody else is staying the same? To me, that's inhumane. So to me, I'm concerned about peer groups and making sure that you are with a significant amount of friends and neighbors, and may not be in your exact class, but hopefully it's some friendly faces in the hallway, on the bus, or wherever. That to me is a priority. And I know a lot of people don't want to hear it, but that's a priority for me.
So then what's a significant number?
I don't know. It's not 7, and it's not 14, and I'm even having a hard time digesting 21 and 22. I mean, you take 22 kids and you divide that, even if it's a 2-section school, K through 5, that's, what, 12 classrooms? Dividing 22 kids? What are the odds that you're going to know 1 kid in your class? Not very much. And is 1 kid enough? So I know people are saying you're not looking at it for the whole town and you're trying to share this pain, but I really am thinking of it as the whole town. And I'm thinking of these kids in these small little pockets who have to move. And I don't know how, I would have a very hard time justifying not moving larger groups of kids so that we can have minimal impact, because I will argue impact to who? Because the impact to those 7 kids is huge. So it may not have an impact all over town, but to those 7 kids, it is devastating. And I keep using 7, and I apologize, because that was probably the lowest number I saw in a scenario that was probably scrapped at this point. But so to me, that's important to me. And it's not because I want everyone to share equal pain. It's not because I'm up here twisting my little mustache saying, how can we really stick it to everyone in town? Which is what some of the tone of some of the emails are. And that's not the intention. The intention is, contrary to what people think. Like, I personally can say that I am trying to look out for all the kids. Like, in my mind, I am trying to look out for them. And if my advocacy is coming off as biased, then I'm sorry, because you just are hearing something that you don't want to hear. But that's not necessarily a bias. So to me, having a significant amount of peer groups, a larger peer group, is important to me.
I'll piggyback on that. So those who are paying attention, we thank you all the way from back last summer and through January when we passed this charge. Just from my own perspective, the point in passing a charge is to answer your question up front, and that after we get maps, there is an individual criteria inserted post-map, which of course anyone can do and is free to do. But that is supposed to guard against, this is our goal, this is what we want to see. So what we did pass was utilization, right? Balancing that out. We have schools that are overcrowded, some that are underutilized, and resolving racial imbalance in a sustainable manner. So those two things for me are important. My thing is I want to make sure that they actually fit. So we have not had that conversation either yet, and ensuring that for the short term and in the long term, whatever scenario the board identifies as its preferred scenario actually fits within the footprint that we have, because I think it's been made clear here this evening, we're not getting an addition by next fall. So at least for the short term it needs to fit, but understanding what the long-term implications as, you know, enrollment is expected to increase, plus we're building in the additional classrooms. So for me, ensuring that we aren't putting art on a cart, we're maintaining our music rooms and all the spaces that people need in order to fulfill our curriculum needs. For me, that's one of my important criteria. Anyone else?
I hear what you're saying on the charge and that being the objective, but it's clear that, like, it seems some of that's changed, and as far as the prioritization ranking behind it, but also that different people on the board have different perspectives about what that actually means.
Mr. Peterson.
That's true of almost every issue that comes before us. You know, all of us are parents. All of us are members of the community. We come to these decisions, I think, all of us with goodwill, and you know, some preconceived notions, and I'm certainly not exempting myself from that. You know, but like, to go back to your specific question, I think what part of this procedure has demonstrated is that the ideal scenario that I wanted to see doesn't exist. And I don't think the ideal scenario for any of the 9 of us that we expected to see exists either. We have to interact with what our consultants are putting before us. And it gets to your point about prioritization. It's difficult for me to say without seeing it and without going through the debate at the table, which I find very important and illuminating. I mean, I can't say if it does A, B, and C, I'm a yes. If it does D, E, and F, I'm a no. I'm very hesitant to talk about it that way. And I've talked in other meetings about what my priorities are. You know, I came into this years ago, coming onto the board with the idea that utilization imbalance was a major issue that I would want to see corrected at some point during my time on the board. But I also recognize, having been through this process, that some of that may have to give. And I'm uncomfortable with that. But I'm also trying to square that with the notion that we need a solution to multiple problems, and what is the best consensus we can come to. And it's an organic process. So, you know, again, all of these threads are important to me. I'm not interested in, you know, I've talked about small groups. I've talked about, you know, the idea of unified ECC location. All of these things are absolutely important. I'm afraid some of them are going to have to give, and I'll only be able to make that decision ultimately when the plan is in front of me. But I think we have to confront the reality that all of us, not one of us, is going to get the plan that we hope that we would get. I don't know whether it illustrates anything about my mindset, but that's the way I think.
The last point that I had, and I guess it's in part rhetorical, but we've been going through this process for a sustained period of time, and it feels like, is it really possible to fully flesh out the next plans, the two or potentially more that we have, or going back to the old ones, given that we have such a tight time frame behind it?
I'll answer that. In terms of the board, I think it is. I think that the superintendent in central office will need some time to be able to operationalize things. And look, I personally can only speak for myself. I'm not expecting to know if this is a $2 million plan, this is a $3 million plan, because again, I believe that it takes actually digging into the budget process, but some idea of where the challenges might be operationally could take some time, and definitely the buses. And, you know, the bus company, we're imploring to be given a heads up now, pretty much, and get prepared in terms of soon you may have a request to come back in short order with what does this look like in terms of that. So that might take some time. That's outside of our control, but I have meetings either already scheduled or on reserve for every Tuesday till that date. So that is a hefty number of meetings still left to go, possibly. Certainly, I'm not going to just call a meeting if it's unnecessary, obviously. But like I said before, we already said that that's the date, and that's going to be the date that something happens, at least by October 30th. What way that goes, can't tell you at this point, obviously. Anyone else want to talk about fleshing out? And that includes having that grandfathering conversation as well, right? Yeah. So 26 will probably be a beefy meeting as well. Okay, thank you so much.
More coffees for that meeting.
Hi, Katie Flynn, 204 Grandview Road. I'm going to start with the ECC, but I might come back around. I was engaged in the process in 2019 when, and it's really hard to get Wi-Fi in here, but I believe it was 10 classrooms we were trying to relocate at that time. Now we're up to 15. During that planning process, and obviously we know that that stopped very shortly, so I don't know what would have happened after March of 2020, but up until March of 2020, I know that Board of Education members toured those facilities. Has that happened during this iteration? Board members?
Not specifically for this purpose.
Okay.
I mean, we've been in buildings for other purposes, but no, we did not, you know, do a do-over, and there have been new members of the board since that process.
So I can't find it online anymore, but I know that there was a rubric that was created that listed bathrooms and all sorts of other things. My first question would be, I would hope that that rubric would have been updated before all this information was sent to SLAM, because to see in memos lists of bathrooms again, to hear conversations about the entrance to Harvester from North Stratfield. I am a North Stratfield parent. I watched our staff last year try to navigate that very narrow entranceway to make sure that our bikers and walkers were not intersected with buses and construction vehicles. I distinctly remember the meeting in 2019 where I made public comments speaking to what I said was illusion of space at North Stratfield that came to be very, very true because of the construction on Harvester and Grandview and Lloyd and Lake Hills. So we have seen this community continually shift and change. So I think my question is, do you feel like you have the requisite information to decide on this clustering of programming? And one step further than that, not only now are we seeing racial diversity clustered on one side of our community, now we are explicitly seeing the ECC being clustered on one side of our community, the densest part of our community. My oldest child just started attending Fairfield Woods Middle School, and I've had the joy of trying to deal with pickup in our 6th grade wing. I haven't even ventured over the 7th and 8th grade wing. I don't know what that looks like, but the Jennings parking lot, I can't imagine adding more and more density to this one specific area of town. So when we're looking at that, are you concerned with that clustering of programming and that continued density on one area of our community?
Mrs. Guernsey.
Thanks so much. And I just wanted to add to your previous question about touring the schools. I have made a request to the chair that we do take the time to offer those tours to the board members, and I believe she's moving forward with that. So thank you, Madam Chair, for doing that. And I do share your concerns and questions about the clustering of programming. I mean, I spoke to before the idea of prioritizing clusters of programs over our neighborhoods. I mean, that's sort of like this tug of war between board members. You know, that's a hard one for me. I don't want to lose neighborhood schools to our clustered programs if there's flexibility in possibly like slightly unclustering them. I don't even know what that looks like, 4 versus 5, 3 versus 5. So these are really good questions, and you know, as a parent of two Woods graduates, I'm very concerned about any increased traffic flow in that area. Hear you. Thank you.
Mrs. Kelly?
I don't want to add levity to the situation, but I don't know of one school who loves their pickup and drop off.
I will completely agree with that.
I mean, I have seen the lines at Sherman that go back to the cemetery. The ones at Ludlow Middle are not great either. Like the high school one is a hot mess. So, I mean, in the most organized way possible. So I'm just throwing that out there. I don't think anybody loves their pickup.
Absolutely, and I think to just piggyback on that, I found, I had the chance to listen to the town capital planning meeting, and I found Mr. Tristani, a few of his comments to be really helpful in terms of, you know, all of our buildings were built at different times. So some of our buildings were built, you know, without small spaces. So while we say that we have 14, 15 classrooms, when you dig into a building like Jennings or North Stratfield that hasn't seen large-scale renovations like a Riverfield or a Mill Hill or a Burr, you see these classrooms that are being used not for one teacher in one section, but for special ed teachers and an ELL, or an ELL teacher. Or, you know, I can speak to North Stratfield. Our OTPT classroom is currently on our stage that we can't utilize for drama programmatics and things like that. So I really have concerns about the speed of this movement. And I will preface, I have 2 graduates of the ECC, and as anyone that knows me very well knows, if I talk about my children, I start to cry up here, so I don't like doing it all that much. But the ECC is a valuable program, and it is valuable enough to make sure that this work is being examined in the most minute of ways, not only for the neighborhood students of North Stratfield and Jennings and Holland Hill and any other building you're considering movement, but for those children and that staff. Also, we heard a parent talk about an hour-and-a-half bus ride. If we have 3 ECC locations within a mile and a half of each other, I would be very concerned as a Mill Hill parent, a Burr parent, a Sherman parent, sending my ECC preschooler. So while you're looking at the staffing issues, which I'm sure are a part of this, and the cost-saving issues of clustering programming, please center all these things in totality. So that would be my request and question and thing I'll put together. I don't know if there's any comments on that.
No, I mean, for me personally, I mean, hey, I'm the one who said in June that, you know, I think eventually we're going to be looking at pre-K in every building. So, you know, at some point, whether it's a couple of years or 10 years, someday it's coming. So, at the end of the day, also, I think that, you know, I can't speak to the piece that you're speaking to about going to the ECC, but what I can speak to as a parent who was far away and would not consider that, and that my concern has been that, not concern, but question at least, is to look at the sites, and is there a location that would really serve the whole of the community versus northeast, really, and be attractive to other community members, especially if we're looking at the ratios. But again, there are constraints, there are building requirements, so I respect the fact that staff needs to have the requirements, at least in the buildings, like bathrooms, first floor classrooms, things like that, that aren't necessarily overcomeable just because we might want to spread things out a little bit more. So just that's my personal take. Mrs. Vitale.
In terms of North Stratfield and the alternate location, there was going to be construction. Part of the money that we put in the capital planning, our capital plan for the ECC, if it was going to be at North Stratfield, was going to be for that site work. I am concerned as a parent who put a child on a bus to the ECC from Dwight. It was a long bus ride, and if we're looking to increase the peer ratio, which I do value, I think having one location on the western side of Black Rock Turnpike probably makes sense. I'm concerned about just traffic at the Jennings Woods site, Fairfield Woods Road, kids walking to school, hearing a lot about traffic in town, not looking to add to that. But I also appreciate, and I, from the very beginning, since December, made my pitch for Holland Hill and the ECC just based on the work that we had done back in 2019. But, SLAM told us that having it at Holland Hill does present some challenges in their planning. And I guess it was the late hour, as we were having that at, 12:30 in the morning, that we just neglected to say, well, look, it's right there, that by saying that it's going to be at Holland Hill, that could present a problem. So I'm already preparing myself for that information when it comes back next week. But yeah, I think that those concerns, having it on, I think that might affect the peer ratio that we're trying to accomplish just because of where the location is. So we'll have to look at it.
Thank you.
Good evening, Dan Panitz, 112 Lawley Boulevard. I currently have 2 children at Sherman. One is a new kindergartner. We waited 2 very difficult years to get into that school district, into that school. My daughter's in kindergarten or 2nd grade there. One of the things that strikes me in listening to the board's comments this evening is the disproportionate geographical impact of certain schools like Sherman, which is isolated down in a certain part of town that makes it predominantly difficult to bus children across town during rush hour, in the morning, in the afternoon. And what consideration has the board given to the perhaps operational efficiency of the busing system and the ability to actually effectuate any kind of busing strategy that would work specifically for schools like Sherman?
Mrs. Gerber. Well, I don't know if I can speak specifically to the nuances of the transportation planning, just because that's why we have a transportation department when they come up with these things. But I do just want to point out, and this is something, this goes back to years ago before I was on the Board of Ed, when we were talking about reopening a 12 elementary school, which was Oldfield, which was closed in 1980. And I think this is a problem, and I'm not saying I'm advocating for that now because things have changed, but just to that point, at the time I hadn't really thought about it, and it kind of woke me up to just the way our schools are planned, and this is something that we've discussed in other ways, is that there is one school south of the Post Road, but very clearly not everyone who lives south of the Post Road can send their children there. It would be enormous. So as a result, we have Oldfield Road as a divider. So if you're on one side of Oldfield Road, you go to Sherman. On the other side, you're going to Riverfield. So we do have a significant group of children who do get on a bus every day, cross Post Road, cross 95 to go to Riverfield. If you go down Oldfield and you cross to South Pine Creek, you have a whole nother group of students who still live south of the Post Road who cross Post Road and 95 to go to Mill Hill. I'm not saying that's ideal for anyone, but I'm just pointing out that unfortunately the way our schools are laid out, much like we have 2 middle schools that are half a mile away from each other, that's a problem for middle school. The fact that we have one school south of the Post Road creates these problems in terms of transportation. So I think unless we were to have Oldfield reopen, and I'm not saying that's going to happen, and I'm not saying I'm advocating for that, but that does kind of paint us into a corner where we are going to have these scenarios where children are going to be crossing Post Road. And at one point, and I can't remember which iteration it was of which charge, I think maybe it was back in 2016, maybe again in 2019, we were talking about, setting up the parameters for SLAM to look at. And one of the things we brought up was to say not to cross a major road. And someone, including, I believe, Mr. Asa, whose children cross Post Road and 95 every day from south of Post Road to go to Riverfield, said, well, we're already doing that. So we'd basically be breaking that rule by putting that language in there. And while I completely understand the rationale behind it, but unfortunately the way our town is situated, where our schools are and where our children are, we are going to be having these problems that are continually going to come up unless another school comes south of the Post Road, and I don't see that happening.
Understood, but Board member Kelly had earlier said that she favors busing or moving larger swaths of students. I don't want to misquote you. But in fact, there is a disproportionate impact to certain schools with the amount of busing, the amount of time they'd have to spend on buses. That's a pretty heavy burden, which could be avoided by applying principles of minimal impact and looking at the specific schools. Has that been considered and tossed around by the board?
Well, and just let me just follow up really quickly, and if Ms. Kelly wants to discuss this, but I do think that it is important to look at our district. There are some children who take very long bus rides right now. We have children at Burr, at Dwight, North Stratfield, Osborne Hill. I mean, some of our districts are very large and cover a great swath of land, and these children are going to be bused significantly. Now they are, and perhaps if they're redistricted, they will as well. I mean, again, that is a problem with our district as it is right now. It's a very large geographical district. Not all our schools are in places that make it easier to take short bus rides. And I am not trying to, negate the concerns of the Sherman community. I do understand that whole group. They are all south of the Post Road, so I understand their concerns and not wanting to take a long bus ride. But I do think it's important to point out that there are many students right now who will take long bus rides, and there may very well be large numbers of students who continue to, perhaps going to new schools as well.
So wouldn't it behoove the board to look at that impact and look at it geographically in their considerations of the SLAM proposals? Would that be a heavier consideration, or is that just put into the mix at an equal weight? What's the thought process?
Well, my initial thought process, and I'll step away from the mic, but just to be clear, I would not be comfortable having any of the discussions that we've been having if it were not for the state telling us that they are tired of us not having solved our racial imbalance plan.
I completely appreciate that.
So that to me, and I didn't address it before when the other person asked, but that is my primary reason why I am, and that's when I look at the plans, that's something that I take seriously. I also am concerned about utilization, which is why some plans that did solve the racial imbalance better, but created scenarios with overcrowding and students receiving services in inappropriate spaces potentially were a reason that I did not support them. But just to be clear, our district and where we are and where the buildings are and where the students are is not going to necessarily lend itself to every child not having to ride a bus for a long time. And I'm not saying I'm happy about that, but again, for me, my primary concern is the racial imbalance number, because that is what we have been tasked to do by the state. If that were not the case, I've been very vocal for 20 years now that I do not like the idea of redistricting, and I still don't like the idea of redistricting, but we are here because we have to do this.
I appreciate that. In terms of what the state law is and whether it should be amended by legislative committee is a whole nother matter that I think that many of us here tonight who value our property values and the impact upon potential taking of value by redistricting has on their property values would probably take that up with the state in short order. But in the meantime, I think we're worried about our kids and their welfare. And the board, who has children ostensibly who have attended these schools, also should be taking into account the welfare of children who have just come off of a global pandemic for over a year and a half just to attend the schools near their homes, and are now, for an artificial reason of racial imbalance under an antiquated 1969 law, being taken from their homes, being put on long bus rides to satiate a can that's been kicked down the road for 17 years in this town. That seems to me to be an undue burden and unjust.
I agree. And as someone who in my paying job works with McKinley students every day, I am incredibly concerned for the McKinley community as well. And I know a lot of these families very well, and it breaks my heart to think that their community will be broken up, and I think that is a huge burden on them. And having worked with children throughout the pandemic, I completely understand the burden that has been on those children. And I think everyone sitting at this table is absolutely aware of that. We're not heartless people who are trying to, take vulnerable children and make them, more in pain than they may already be. None of us are happy that we are dealing with this. And I just want to make that perfectly clear.
I appreciate that again, and no one is putting the onus upon you personally or any individual board member in doing so. However, the fact remains that this is something that could be just out of imbalance in another 5 years from here. Certain schools, like Sherman, which can't do any renovations above 30% of its asset value, are not in a position to upgrade its facilities to then accommodate greater influxes of students. And that's not something that's going to be on the table anytime soon, to my understanding, unless I'm mistaken or any board member knows otherwise. So I wonder, what's the long-term plan here? Is this just to satiate the state's demand for now, pending an upgrade of this law or an amendment of this law for undue burden and exception? Are we just pushing this down the road yet again and now making a decision because we're forced to by virtue of need for state money? Honestly, this is something that's been long present in this town. Socioeconomic conditions have greatly contributed to the state of the being of this citizenry and the lack of diversity at our schools. This is not the fault of any one person or certainly not of the board. So as we sit here today, we are essentially just pushing this down the road a bit. Does anyone on the board have a comment towards that?
Mrs. Maxon-Kennelly.
A couple of comments. You made reference that we've been kicking the can down the road for 17 years. I would slightly disagree with that because anyone who's been listening to the magnet conversation knows that the chief appeal of the magnet was trying to do this in a voluntary fashion. For 17 years, since we were first identified, 16 years, we have been taking action, all of a voluntary nature, trying to move that needle. We got below the 25% 1 year. We've had other times we've gotten the needle to wiggle a bit. I was very hopeful. I was part of a cultural diversity task force way back in 2008 that attempted to work on this and solve this in a voluntary fashion. Ultimately, did any of it work? No. Did any of us know that at the time? Also no. So that that is a phrase we've heard many times. You've been kicking down the road till now. No, we have been attempting unsuccessfully to address it in a manner that was least painful because it was voluntary in nature. So I just, again, we're talking about education, and so many people are new to Fairfield, so they may not have been aware of that, that we have been trying. Regarding the second, what was the second part you said?
I'm sorry?
The second part you said. I wanted to address that. And last question. Long term. I think when we were very emphatic at the last meeting and giving the direction to Mr. Testani of shooting for that 20% as a max, the idea of that is that this would be a longer term solution. Does that mean that we know, again, I can't speak to any revision, amendment to the state statute or anything like that, but that I think we sincerely believe that this would put us in a far stronger position for at least a decade, maybe longer. That's why we weren't satisfied with only getting McKinley. Again, that scenario 4B was in the neighborhood of 23, 24, even 25%. That was not a workable solution. That's exactly to your point of what's this Band-Aid? We're going to be right back at this. So we are looking for something more aggressive precisely so that this community can do this once and move on from that. Those were the 2 points I wanted to bring up.
No, I thank you for that response. I think that there's a sort of a but if that sort of follows that. But if there is a legislative action, which there probably would be if there was significant redistricting that impacted everyone on different levels. And I appreciate every parent's concern who has a different school district that they want to attend. They want their children to attend, either for walking or other. But having transported my children across town many times during rush hour, it is getting worse and worse. We're a town of 60,000 people. Simply taking an equal number from each school and just sort of, for lack of a better analogy, splitting the baby and sending everybody partially across lines to different schools to address the racial imbalance is going to have a disparate effect upon certain geographic areas more than others. And specifically with the busing shortage that we know of, and some of us have already experienced, and I've only been in town for 3 years, but know of the legislative history. It is something that's ongoing. And this is just going to trigger another great problem, that is our kids sitting on buses all day.
And obviously, that's going to have to be part of our future conversation. Even if we like this, can tolerate the next scenario that comes our way, that we say this is the one we're focused in on, even there, where there's still going to be possible tweaking of, you know, this doesn't work, you, gosh darn it, you gave us another group of 7, that's not satisfactory. You gave us a group of 90, why? Like, can you defend that choice to us? Because none of it, no part of our charge has ever been, you must make sure to move a certain percentage of each school. That's not purposeful. Everything has been towards a goal, which we've been trying to achieve. And so there could be a challenge, you know, at the meeting where we say, we're doing this, well, we need to explain what is this movement here achieving. So that will be part of the conversation. Regarding the changing of the state statute law, look, I'm not going to tell you you're wrong, that it can't happen. I do know that, again, back in 2007, I went to a meeting at Ward where McKinley was first identified as racially, or second time identified as racially imbalanced. And at the time, John McKinney was was the state senator from Fairfield. And I approached him asking, what's going on at the state? Why are they in favor of this? And his answer was very direct. The rest of the state is not interested in changing this because, as I think you've probably noticed, very few parts of the state are affected by this. So what are you complaining about? And this kind of gets to a point Mr. Testani alluded to a little bit. That idea that Fairfield gets a reputation then by fighting this, if we actually, you know, and again, Mrs. Jacobson is right, whatever private citizens choose to do is up to them. But the perception by a lot of the state is you're trying to maintain separate but equal. Going right back to 1896, that there's all sorts of ways to couch that in terms of you're trying to keep populations isolated, which needless to say comes across in a very, could be racist, could be biased way. I've heard all of the conversations. I don't think that's what's generating this. But the state, again, going back to what he told me then, the state is not interested in Fairfield's problem. Their view is solve it. So if you find a way to get the state to really consider what they're doing to our McKinley district, to that school, which is a wonderful school and shows such incredible academic improvement with its students, we'd be interested in the argument. But we've tried to bring the State Board of Ed down to see McKinley. And they all say, this is wonderful, make the rest of Fairfield look like this. They're sort of missing the point, but that's where we are. So I just, again, it's another bit of backstory. It's not like we haven't come at it from that direction as well, of look what you're making us do. And implicit, shame on you, but we've really gotten no traction.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name's Greg Bosch. I live at 470 Jackman. I was hoping to just ask some kind of rapid fire clarifying questions, if I may. Not looking to get into a huge back and forth. Scheduling wise, it's unfortunate that we don't have what sounds like 4C and maybe D, if I can use those terms before us tonight. Will this board commit to having another community conversation once all of the plans have been released?
I can see if there is space available at this point. Certainly can look into it.
It's hard to know how to direct questions or make a comment about what isn't before us. I was hoping to get a little clarity because I heard some discussion, but why is it that second graders can't be on the second floor of an elementary school?
There's state guidelines around that. Apparently we have some at Stratfield, but it's really frowned upon. K through 2 should be on a first floor egress.
Okay. And bathrooms at our facility seem to be driving this ECC conversation Is it a state guideline that bathrooms are in kindergarten classrooms?
No.
Okay. So how is that bathroom conversation affecting placement of ECC? Is it driving it? Is it a nice to have?
According to history, as it was mentioned a little while ago, there was a rubric that was created 2 superintendents ago as to what would be an acceptable ECC environment. But there is no guidelines even for a classroom bathroom from the state perspective either.
Okay, thank you for those policy clarifications. The next set of questions are around how you think about equitability as you're making these decisions. You know, I've heard some questions come from the audience tonight that land sour with me. I'm not trying to put anybody down. I'm glad that everybody's here trying to educate themselves on this topic. But what resources are you leaning on given that our district doesn't have a DEI coordinator at this time? How do you decide what is an equitable plan for Fairfield? So maybe I'll put a little color on that while you're thinking. You know, I've watched these state meetings, and in at least one of them, we were up there championing the newly hired DEI coordinator for the district as a reason that Fairfield is trying hard to get this right. And so now it feels like we're a rudderless ship, to use that analogy. Maybe you disagree, maybe you do agree, but ultimately, how do you think about what is equitable when choosing between these plans?
Mrs. Maxon-Kelly.
I think at this point, things like the DEI coordinator were, first of all, it appealed to us. Obviously, we supported it as a position. The state was impressed by it. There was ultimately no feedback from that position on the work that we are doing. So we as a board are committed to that, this is going to sound so weak, to that sensitivity of being aware that there's going to be a lot of dynamics going on when we act. And again, thus the reason for a certain degree of urgency to our timeline. This transition, it's not going to look the same at every school, nor should it. Because what one school, and I'm not going to use names, but I can think of one school moving to another where elementary school wise, it's going to be it's not going to be as big a deal. I can also think of 2 other schools that students shifting from one to the other. There's going to be very different needs and very different sensitivities and very different conversations that will need to be happened so that we are looking out for all of our children. But that ultimately we're being driven to a degree by numbers. We have to get the numbers down so that we're not having this conversation again in 2 or 3 years. Again, that's why 4B was a non-starter. It really didn't do, it would have moved a bunch of kids and not achieved that goal. So I don't know if that answers your question.
I mean, I don't want to believe that you're saying that this is just about solving a math equation.
We have to get our racial, we are charged by the state with getting our getting racially balanced, correct? We also have to place our ECC. We know for a fact that it is next year going to grow out of the bounds of our current classrooms, and that we are also not educating our 4-year-olds in the ECC in the best manner possible. We need full day offerings. So those are children needing an education, and it is a numbers issue because we therefore need a certain number of classrooms to do that. So do I also think that there are going to be a lot of intangible benefits to some of our schools becoming more diverse? Sure. However, I don't like the idea or the language or the attitude of let's use some students and just sprinkle them about. That's not what our conversation has been. So I feel like you're looking for something, and I'm going to fail no matter what I say.
No, that I don't think that's true. I'm trying to refocus the conversation, I guess, a little bit around, I don't believe you to be saying by any means necessary. And that there are more equitable plans? and they're less equitable.
Sure, if you took a satellite from McKinley and a satellite from Dwight, that's a non-starter. How crazy to bus kids in that manner across town. So you're absolutely right. This is not a by any means necessary. That's why we're not talking about get McKinley down to 10 or 15%, because that would be such an aggressive approach and would involve such wide-ranging busing. This board has walked back from that, because that would be getting more to the by any means necessary.
So what I was trying to get at is what resources are in your ear? Who are you listening to? What are you leaning upon when you make these decisions? Or perhaps I am hearing you correctly, it's just a math equation, and however we can get it to work is the right way.
Let me think about that for a second, but Ms. Jacobson, can I defer to Mr. Peterson?
Yeah, just quickly wanted to respond to your question about DEI leadership, and that is an area of great concern to me. I've spoken to the superintendent about that on many occasions. I think that it's very difficult to have conversations like this without expertise within our district in this area, or even a consultant that we work with in this area. So I do think that is a big hurdle that we continue to face. And, you know, I hope it's something that we can look at in the new budget season to try and, you know, at least looking forward, have some expertise in that area. But, you know, in terms of in this process, I don't think that, well, I speak for myself, I don't have that expertise to give to this conversation, sadly.
Is there anybody else?
Mr. Peterson.
To your last point, I would just say that it's a false dichotomy. The idea that either we're being driven by an equation or we're relying on DEI experts to make the decision. The truth is, we're in an all of the above situation. We're bringing our own experience to bear. We're relying on our consultants. We're asking a lot of questions of central office. We're listening to the community in a variety of ways, both in person and email and whatever person wants to stop me and Stop and Shop. It's a multifactorial decision-making process that we're making. And again, as I said to a commenter earlier, it's an organic process. I don't at all see it as being one or the other. We can't ignore the math. We can't ignore the equity issues. It's one of the things that makes it the most challenging decisions that I think this board has faced in many years is because of that multifactorial nature. So I'm uncomfortable talking about it as if it's A or B. It's A to Z.
I just want to be clear, I'm not suggesting that you are or that it is A or B. I'm asking what those resources are that are also at the table advising as to what the right solution is. The way I see this is SLAM throws out a scenario and everybody personally reacts. And that equity is absent from the conversation. And that doesn't mean that I'm advocating for 1,000 kids to be affected in these plans. It means that when we talk about busing, scenario 4 buses McKinley kids through their old neighborhood, past their old school, and to another. And yet some might object to being bused for a minute longer, when we know that if we elect scenario 4 that we are explicitly doing that to children. So I guess kind of what I'm hearing is there isn't a DEI coordinator, a equity consultant, somebody from the state advising Fairfield as to what is the right.
I will say that in the May 2022 meeting, which it sounds like from your comments that you've watched, they did make some very specific points about McKinley. They made the point, as Ms. Kennelly said, they would like every school to be like McKinley. And frankly, that's a laudable goal. That would take a lot of moving around resources from McKinley, if you want to think about it that way, which none of us up on this table do. I find that unpalatable in the extreme. But they were also concerned about achievement gap between kids at McKinley and kids at other schools around town which have lower minority populations. That's something we can track moving forward. I think their hope was that those achievement gaps would be smoothed, at least, by a redistribution of some of that population to other schools in town. And again, that's a thing that ultimately we'll be able to track, but up here we kind of have to decide, well, what is the balance? What is the correct balance to be? And, you know, to echo something that Ms. Gerber said earlier, I think on this board for many years I was the one who was most in favor of doing a utilization-based redistricting. I didn't want to do this now either. This is a decision that's been forced upon us. And we're trying as best we can to feel our way through. Could we do it better and perhaps more equitably if we had more time? I could concede that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Can I get a show of hands? How many people are left to speak? Looks like two.
Hi, I'm Deb Herzig, 206 Orchard Hill Lane, and as luck would have it, somebody already asked my question, so I'm going to try to reframe it a little bit and ask it again. And so when I looked at the prior schedule, it looked like, you know, we're obviously a little bit behind. In June, we should have already had a scenario that you would have voted on. It's September, we don't have a scenario yet. This meeting, technically when you set the schedule, we would have been discussing a scenario that would have already been voted on. And so the community is missing an opportunity here to really ask directed questions. I believe my kids are impacted in scenario 4, but I honestly have no idea. I've looked, I've cut and pasted that map. There's no street names. We saw street names for 4B. And so I think that there should be an opportunity for the community to have an option to come forward and ask you these questions once we get the new scenario. So I would like to ask if that's going to be an opportunity for us.
I will see if we can get a room and a space and a quorum of the board and FairTV and all of that once we have that scenarios. But I certainly can ask the board if they have another evening or it's not so easy to plan meetings. Just want to put it out there in terms of getting a quorum, FairTV, a space reserved and all that. So certainly I can work with the superintendent and see if we can get another one on the calendar before the end of October.
That would be excellent. And also along those lines, will there be streets mapped for 4C and 4B when they're presented, or 4D, whatever it is?
I don't know.
Okay. Why were there streets named in 4B if we're not going to name them in any of the other scenarios?
The turnaround time might be too quick to do that. Okay. But not saying that they can't do it, they just couldn't promise that.
My last concern too is I have a 3rd grader and 5th grader. We just moved here 2 years ago. The irony of that is we moved so my kids could go to the same schools. If we had stayed in New York, my kids, one would have had to go to a private school because of his special ed needs, and one would have gone to public school. And so, ironically, we moved here so the kids could stay in the same school and get the supports they need, and it's been amazing. And now we're in a scenario where they could potentially be moved and be attending completely different schools for their entire career. So in scenario 4, my daughter would move elementary, middle, and high schools. Complete feeder change. She would move with maybe 3 or 4 of her peers, that I can tell by the map that's been drawn out. That's a dramatic change for a kid who just moved 2 years ago. I know she's not the only one in that scenario or situation, and also just based on the fact that, you know, having 3 or 4 kids move, and literally, it's almost like moving to a new town. You're not going to school with the same middle school kids, you're not going to school with the same high school kids. Are there going to be consideration when you kind of refine those maps to look at it from that perspective too? Because I'm a parent, I can spin stuff to my kid, like if I need to tell her she needs to change elementary schools for 2 years, like I can figure that out. I can talk her into that. But if I tell her she's basically never going to go to school with her brother ever again, never overlap with him ever again, as a 2 working parent households, like the inequity that creates for us is another consideration that you should be thinking about too. And then also, like, that's a real hard sell for her. So is that something that you'll consider when you look to refine these maps?
I'm not sure what we find. What you're talking about,
Where you
Peter?
look to see
That's
that,
grandfather.
well, you're basically saying you're not going to grandfather people, though they're in 3rd or 5th grade. So sounds to me like that's not really looking like a realistic option.
I guess I'm just confused on what your question is.
Would you be looking at small pockets of kids? Because in the group of kids that my children would potentially be rezoned with is about 36 kids.
Are you asking if we would move more children than comes on the map in order to move a larger segment of the population?
No, what I'm asking you is if you'd actually look at how dramatic the moves are. So moving a child just from one elementary school to another zoned elementary school is a lot different than moving a child to a different elementary school, different middle school, and different high school than what they're originally zoned for today.
So you're saying possibly just taking them off the map altogether if it was too small rather than making it bigger?
Or just move the elementary school and then figure out the feeder patterns from there.
I can't answer that in terms of the whole board or speak for the whole board at this point, but until we have the scenarios and things in front of us and we get into the refinement process and, you know, does it fit and the busing and all of that, I mean, I think this board is obviously going to do its due diligence in looking at everything that we need to look at.
Okay. Because I think when you look at it in terms of impact, that's pretty extreme for any kid. And then when you're looking at the middle schoolers too, having a 5th grader knowing that he could be changed and only move with like 3 or 4 of his peers to a new middle school, that's crazy. I mean, and again, he moved 2 years ago. He's just settling in. And then I'm going to tell him he's going to move to a new middle school and know pretty much no one. That's crazy. So I'm really appreciative if you can make those considerations when we do get the maps, and not just for my own children, but for any children that could be in a similar circumstance. And my last thing I'd like to say is my kids went to a magnet school in Brooklyn, and it was a STEAM magnet school. It was a Title I school, and you honestly wouldn't have even known it was a magnet school. It just had special programming that all the kids participated in, but I think the board or whoever kind of talked and presented this scenario, we've done a disservice to really talk about what that's like. It's not like you walk in and there's like science experiments going on and all this other stuff. It's a nuanced change. And we loved going to that school. Again, if it could have supported our educational needs, we would have stayed there, but it couldn't. And it was wonderfully diverse. And I think that does deserve more consideration. I think there's been, this perception that a magnet school is like very hardcore, restrictive type of curriculum, and it's the opposite of that from what we experienced. So I would just encourage you to think about it more broadly and creatively like that. Thank you.
Hi there, I'm Sarah Simbolin. I have our Mill Hill, 1491 Mill Hill. I currently have one child at Mill Hill. I do also have 2 little ones, including a 3-month-old who's hopefully sleeping right now, and a middle child who will be doing, because of the date change, another additional year in preschool. So she'll eventually be going to Mill Hill as well. I guess my question for clarifying purposes is, we're looking to do a big bang, right? We don't want to be redoing redistricting in another 5 years or even having that conversation. What are the numbers? And maybe, I don't know, are you the SLAM consultant? I know you're on a laptop. If you
The SLAM people are not here.
No, okay. I don't know if any of the SLAM consultants are here to actually speak on their own behalf, but what numbers are you looking at in terms of current numbers and also the projections? I've not been part of any, we're relatively new to town. We haven't been part of any conversation in terms of, well, I also had, I had just had another baby, right? Like, that's another person to be considered as part of utilization, the racial imbalance, maybe not ECC, but what types of numbers are you looking at now, and then also future projections for student enrollment?
When you say what types of numbers?
Where's the source of that data? Surveys? Is it from a certain date or from a certain year, or are there current surveys happening?
I don't know what you mean by surveys, but the SLAM is constantly updating our enrollment projections based on a multitude of factors. So we had 10-year enrollment projections done last June that includes things like development, in-migration, birth rates,
Okay.
persistency ratios, out-migration, private school enrollment, all of these different indicators. And then obviously when we went into redistricting conversations, as they went through the process and started building our scenarios, they updated that. And there's not a huge difference between June and when they came out, but there is a difference to the high. To the increase. So they are using the best available information. If you're asking if SLAM is knocking on doors to see if you've had a newborn, I don't think that that's the case.
I just didn't know any source of data. In my previous career, that was what I did.
You know, look, there's always going to be a margin of error, right? Of course, people move out, people move in, people have babies, and so there's always going to be a degree of margin. It's not an exact science, which is why the board builds in things like headroom to make sure that we're not maxing out classrooms or maxing out our buildings, because one year there might be a bubble and you need an extra section or whatever it may be. So we plan for headroom in order to allow for population shifts. Sometimes neighborhoods turn over, like Sherman was super crowded, then it's not so much anymore. Osborne Hill was super crowded, then it dropped really low, and now it's back up again. I mean, these are natural ebbs and flows to the populations of our communities, and I think the consultants understand that, and so do the members of this board.
Okay. My one other comment would be, there isn't a silver bullet. Not everyone we know is not going to be happy. I think anyone having to move is going to be unhappy. You guys are doing your day jobs and then coming up here and spending all night talking to us, which we appreciate. I would just say, time is not on our side. Trying to be as focused as possible in terms of what the state is demanding, right? And then having a multi-phased approach. The state also has to have good faith in Fairfield and know that you guys are trying your best and you have been working on this for so long. A multi-phased approach. I don't want to say it, but I'm going to say it. Grandfathering maybe included, right? I think is in the best interest of anyone, and I think would show the state good faith. Thank you for your time.
Hi, I'm Melissa Miller, 462 Wormwood Road. I just had a question of clarification because it was mentioned and thrown out there the concept of sister schools and why, in the spirit of leaving no stone unturned and putting scenarios out there, why the history of, I heard it mentioned a little bit, why it hasn't been considered, and as in a K to 12, K to 2 and 3 to 5, what's the background on that?
Who would like to speak to that? Mrs. Maximilian.
I honestly think that it's, and maybe I'm wrong, we so resoundingly rejected it about 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, that when it was then, okay, wait a minute, a perfect example of something that we were so positive, that's a non-starter, it suddenly didn't look so bad, and it just never really got a lot of traction. And I think one of the reasons it didn't have buy-in, this is pure conjecture because we didn't get very far with it, therefore the public never really weighed in on it. I think a lot of people would have said, why are we having to be sister schooled when you could just do it to 2 schools and it would solve racial imbalance? And yet we as a board, again, 5 years ago had said, if we're doing sister schools, we need to be doing it to the town. We shouldn't be carving out, okay, we're going to do this, my wording, we're going to do this to you two, but everybody else, we're not. So the position 5 years ago had been, if we're doing it for everybody, and that very quickly was and we're not going to do it. So now when it came up, I just think it just never really got a lot of traction or a lot of buy-in from the public, because why should we have to do that when you could do it to just 2 schools? Kind of getting back to the beginning point when Dr. Jones presented it to the first time. Sorry, getting late. I'd be curious if anybody on the board had a different perception than myself. I think it just ultimately, we didn't get a lot of traction going with it. We never actually spoke about it enough.
Mrs. Kelly.
I wasn't on the board when 5 years ago when that happened, and I admit I did not watch whatever meetings were happening back then. I did mention it when we were talking about putting the charge together originally. I still think it's actually a good idea, but at the time, we were really in a crunch to get the charge done, and the feedback from the board was, it was another transition. So kids changing school buildings K through 2, or from pre-K to K, and then from 2 to 3, and then from 5 to 6. It was just another transition. And then there was also some considerations regarding having, if the school started at the same time, having 2 kids from the same house getting on 2 different buses to go to 2 different schools. It just seemed like a lot of, there was just a lot of, but I do think that it's something, after we fix all this, and maybe 20 years from now, when everybody in this room is retired on a beach somewhere, we can talk about it. They can talk about it.
Okay. Anyone else? All right, so just thank you all for taking the time tonight to come out and talk to us. We know it's weighing heavily on everyone's mind, and appreciate that fact, so appreciate you coming out. Just a few reminders that obviously we have a meeting on Tuesday, in case you haven't heard, so that will be, and the Tuesday after that, and maybe the Tuesday after that, so just keep abreast on our website. Things get posted there. If you have any questions on that, let us know. But with that, I will take a motion to adjourn. Mr. Peterson, can I get a second, please? Mrs. Ritelli, all in favor? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.